all over the world. I'm Daniel Ellenberg, the founder and director of the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative, which is aligned and associated with the Global Compassion Coalition. Thank the Global Compassion Coalition for hosting this event, which I'm very excited to participate in. You may notice that I have a black eye and my lip is kind of a mess. And so, full disclosure, I had a couple of concussions over the weekend, so I'm not 100% here today. So I'm going to do my very best to be as focused as possible. But as John Lennon said, life is what happens when you're making other plans, and that's certainly what happened here today. In the case that I can't continue for cognitive or my voice goes, my good buddy Rick Hansen, who is the founder of the Global Compassion Coalition, will step in for me, and I've given him a whole bunch of questions. I'm sure he'll do a fantastic job, as he always does. So I want to just tell a quick little story that happened probably 10, 12 years ago, where my wife and I, who live in Northern California, went to a beach, and it was a beautiful beach with huge cliffs on the side, and it was just a normal day out there. And I saw these two little boys frolicking in the water, probably like 4 and 6, 5 and 6, 5, 7, and they were just like spastic, and they were having the most joyous time. And I just had this very quick experience of feeling both happy and sad. Happy because they were so full of themselves and so full of life, and sad because I thought, there's a good likelihood that they're going to learn about the boy box and how to stuff their emotions and not show much enthusiasm in life and just pull it all in. And we're going to go into a lot of what happens with boys today in our 4 expert panels. But I think that we really need to look at what's happening with boys, and I think with men in general these days, because the reality is there is a crisis among males. And it seems a little oxymoronic in a certain way to think of it that way, because males have been privileged for certain, throughout history. And at the same time, these days, it's not looking quite as good. And so I'm not here to make political statements about it. And I'm not here to make comparisons, because obviously girls and women and gender fluid people have their challenges. So this isn't about trying to garner all the support for boys and men. But I do think, strangely enough, paradoxically, it's been an underserved emotional population in general. Men are dying 6 years younger on average than women, committing suicide at almost 4 times the rate. The young boys are dropping out of school. They're just not doing well. And anyone who has younger boys is aware of this. There are 2 books I would point you to. One is Richard Reeves' of Boys and Men, which has come out in the last year and has gotten a lot of notoriety. And also Warren Farrell, The Boy Crisis. Warren is going to be on our 4th panel today. So there's a lot of opportunities to learn more about the challenge there. And so one of the challenges is that the old ways that guys showed up is just not as valued as it used to be. And I'm not saying it should be, but the times are changing. We are in the middle of a paradox change. And I think that we need to really be thinking about, how do we raise our boys and how do we support males to be compassionate and to be self-compassionate? Because really at the core of everything is compassion, because the reality is life is challenging. And I've noticed that obviously with the concussions I had, and I had to tell my panelists that it's possible that my buddy Rick will step in for me. And so that they knew that in advance, I received lots of compassionate responses, which is, really touching. And we as human beings need that. And we also need to practice self-compassion. So our mission at the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative is to really help foster a global movement that we're calling the Men's Compassion Movement, helping boys and men become more compassionate and more self-compassionate. We have a threefold approach, which is that we want to support boys and men to become more compassionate themselves. We want boys and men to be more compassionate to others, and we also want others to be more compassionate to boys and men. And so we're going to be really focusing on these different areas in our four panels. We do welcome your involvement coming up, and so you will receive an email after this that's going to give you information about how you could potentially be involved with us. We're scaling now. We are working with other organizations. There are 13 organizations who are supporters right now of the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative. You will receive their names. Check them out. We're not trying to hoard everything. We know that if we're going to really change the world, we need all people on board. You know, it's been said that it takes a village to raise a child. If this is true, and I believe it is, it takes a movement to change the world. So we really want to name that we're looking at a movement here. We're not looking at this as some isolated little event, some little nice little online offering. We're really looking at how do we make a larger difference, because we really want to raise the bar. And so compassion, just a quick little word about it. Compassion is a recognition that someone or someones are suffering in some way and have a genuine desire to help alleviate that suffering. So that's what we're working with. And compassion is often misunderstood as this nicey, feeling bad for poor you, pity. No, it takes a lot to be compassionate. And what part of what we want to say is that real men are compassionate. We're not just tight and tough and everything. We have to be compassionate, because if we're going to be part of a global community, we need to act the part. And so I want to send out some special appreciations to our panel members, to Rick Hansen in particular, who is one of my very closest buddies. I feel teary. I'm a little more emotional right now after having these concussions right now. So I'm going to be real about what's true for me right now. Because for me, this is a hard mission. And I feel pain every day looking out the world, and I see the level of hatred and animosity there is. And I have my own. So I'm not saying that I'm not a part of the problem, but I really want to be the solution. And I would love all of us to be part of the solution. Let me make this a much better world. And so I also want to thank Rachel and Alex and Matt from Global Compassion Coalition, who work closely with me, and a whole bunch of other people who I've spoken with, too many to name right now. So with that, I would like to introduce our first panel. And by the way, there will be larger bios that come out. So look for an email from the Global Compassion Coalition, which will say more about each of the panelists. So you'll learn more about them as we go through the panels. But right now, I'd like to introduce our first panel. So if we can get that online. Hello, you wonderful people.
Hello, Dan.
Hi.
Hi. So this is Judy Chu, who teaches at Stanford. And for those of you who saw The Mask You Live In, was a major part of that. The Mask You Live In was a fantastic movie. I highly recommend it, about how boys learn to put on their mask, how they learn the boy box, and we'll be talking about that. And we have Mary Gordon, who is a creator of Roots of Empathy, a beautiful program I highly recommend those of you who don't know about the Roots of Empathy to really look into that. And we have Paul Gilbert, the creator of Compassion Focused Therapy and the Compassionate Mind Foundation, or by the way, who are our supporters. Roots of Empathy and Compassionate Mind Foundation are supporters of our work, and we hope to work with you all closely as time goes on. So with that, I'd like to kind of open it up and tell us some about how you see the plight of boys these days. Because what we're going to be particularly looking at in this panel, which is called Understanding and Celebrating the Beauty of Males, how to nurture healthy development in boys and young male men. We're going to be looking at what is indicated, what would be great. How can we raise healthy boys who become healthy men? And what are the obstacles to that? And so I'd like to open up with a really large question. What do you see as what does healthy male development look like from your experience? And anyone can jump in.
Well, can I just take you up on a point that you meant that we're on the threshold of major change? And we are. And the major change is really quite important because the new physics is beginning to show us that what we have as a brain may well be a headset, and our real nature with the nature of consciousness itself. That this is fundamental. So one of the key issues is that boys get educated about what it is to be a human. And to be a human means we have a biological brain. And that biological brain can do good things, but it can also do very, very bad things. Humans are one of the most vicious, nasty species that have ever existed. And a lot of that is generated by males, and particularly males against males. Males have done terrible things to other males and women and children and so on. So we have to help men understand that they have a brain that can lead them into the dark side if they're not careful. They need to be clear about that. That's not their fault. That's partly the way the brain is set up. But culture plays such a crucial impact onto whether we're going to use our brain for our highest values or our less highest values. And that's very, very important. And Mary will be talking about that and empathy development and so on and so on. But the first thing, if we're going to create males and indeed humans to follow compassion, we have to understand, help them understand what it is to be alive, what it is to have a consciousness, what it is to have a brain.
Beautiful.
Let me jump right on there, Paul. I'm with you. The work that we do with Roots of Empathy, the first thing we do is establish what does it mean to be human. And we do this through a tiny baby. And basically what the children come to, being human, means that you can feel. And obviously that you can think, Paul. But I think the massive situation we have in the world about emotional illiteracy is a problem that affects males more than females. So to your point, Daniel, what do we do? What is necessary to raise compassionate men? It's to give them opportunities to experience all of these emotions that we require in order to be full-fledged human beings, not to instruct them, but to help them construct themselves.
Beautiful. Judy, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I agree with both what Paul and Mary said. And I think that really at the center of the work, the research that I did is the idea that humans are, building on Daniel Stern's work on the interpersonal world of the infant. I mean, humans are born into connection. And so I think connection is at the heart of the response to your question, what does healthy male development look like? Infant studies show that we are, all humans are born with a fundamental capacity and desire for relationship connection, mutual, supportive, what studies have shown to be protective. And so if we're able, it's not about teaching boys and men something that, foreign to them. It's something that's inherent. And so to really foster that, as Mary said, to really give them opportunities to experience and develop and just value these things in themselves, these skills and qualities that will serve them very well in their professional and their personal lives.
It's very strange, isn't it, that our fundamental wiring isn't honored. Like we are literally wired to connect. I mean, with more recent research in neuroscience has revealed the social brain, the default mode network, where we're connected to each other in these very deep ways. And obviously the beginning of that is the mother-infant relationship. And yet there's this dynamic that occurs over time, and I'd love all of you to speak to that, where boys learn to disconnect, that somehow being male is to be disconnected. And that may be a great preparation for war, but it's not a great preparation for love. You know, and so this is such a big problem, because part of what's occurred throughout history is that we have like the male role and the female role, and they can be different to some degree in different cultures, but there are some similarities. And one of the things that we see cross-culturally, if not in all cultures, but in many to most, is this need that males learn to that they have to prove masculinity. There's a theory in gender which is really about this proving masculinity. It's called precarious manhood, and there are different steps to it. One is that males learn that they have to prove their masculinity. Two is that it's hard to do and easy to lose. And three is that it must be demonstrated in public. And how do they do this? By being tough, being tougher than. It's a terrible context for creating community. Now, it may be for creating communities that are fighting other communities, and they can send their warrior men off to war, but it's not good for the future of this planet, and we can see some of the impact of that. So I'd love all of you to speak to how do we change this so that we can really elongate what it means to be male. And just say one last thing, which is one of my big pet peeves, and I've been involved with gender work for 40 years now, leading men's groups and doing my dissertation. I've been amazed at how so much has been around women need to adhere to the female role, being nurturing, kind, and supportive. Men to the male role, being assertive, direct, take no prisoner. And I go like, why is that not the full range of being human? Why can't women be all of those things and men be all of those things, and gender fluid people be all of those? Like I want us to expand our operating system. So I'll toss that out to you now.
Well, I think the point you make is an excellent one, is culture. And we know that humans evolved, particularly in hunter-gatherer societies, egalitarian.
Judy, you should such a
What's happening? What happened?
Paul should keep going.
Paul, keep going.
Okay.
I think we have a sound glitch here.
Yeah.
So we've come from primates stock, and primates are not terribly nice to each other. But humans went through a period of hunter-gatherer for quite a few million years, and were egalitarian, and where contribution was the way in which males got status, not aggression and violence and all of this narcissistic stuff. And that is basically, as Judy and Mary said, and you say, that's really where we function best in the sort of close hunter-gatherer group. Unfortunately, we developed agriculture, groups got very big, and dominant males got control of wealth, and then the rest is history. All of the empires have all been based on dominant males, and then you get this warrior class, as you say. And we haven't really yet found a way in which we can actually get back to our basic nature, which is to be in relatively small groups, or at least with people that we feel we can make a connection to, and we want to make a contribution. We want to be valued for making a contribution, empathic and otherwise. So the main problem is, how do we deal with tribalism? How do we deal with those warrior males that you talk about? How do we deal with this intense competition and all that psychology, which is set up for warrior type societies, when we actually don't want warrior societies? We never really have, but at least now we can begin to understand why we are the way we are and how we can take steps to remediate that.
I want to say one last thing before we open to the
Daniel.
Okay,
Yeah.
Go on, Mary. Go on, Mary.
Okay. This is a stop-start. I'm with you. I just wanted to say I'd love to contribute, but I'd like to build on Judy sharing her research about 5-year-olds, because what she has discovered about 5-year-old boys, I think, generalizes the whole society. of how we might think about the importance of relationship and connection and what she's learned about 5-year-old boys. And then I'm happy to chime in.
Great. You've been volunteered.
Okay. Well, let me try to be succinct about it. I mean, basically, what my research highlights is that boys have these relational capabilities, including the capacity to be authentic and direct and articulate and attentive. And that these abilities, because we tend to deem them, tend to gender them feminine, our society does, tend to get overlooked or undervalued in boys, or are sometimes even actively discouraged because they're gendered feminine, and boys are supposed to, as you mentioned, Daniel, prove their masculinity, namely by aligning with norms of masculine behavior and by differentiating themselves or distinguishing themselves from what's associated with femininity. And so, definitely that they have these capabilities, and that start beginning at early childhood, as Mary pointed out, around ages 4, 5, 6, as they start to enter schools and public spaces, and they learn the rules, like you said, the boy box, the man box, how they're supposed to appear if they want, and if they want to be acceptable boys or desirable boys. And so they learn these rules mainly because they're motivated to connect with others, because they're seeking that connection. And they're told that if they do these things, tough, stoic, self-sufficient, then people will want to be with them. But ironically and tragically, it actually leads them away. It makes it less likely for them to develop the very kinds of relationships that motivated them to align their behaviors in the first place. So, but one silver lining is that you see in the 4-year-old boys that I studied, you see in boys everywhere, probably the ones on the beach, that when this kind of the rules of masculinity come in, there's a healthy resistance against that. As resistance has been defined as the assertion or defense of one's humanity. We feel that we don't like impositions that lead us to compromise things that we know or feel are of value, including our empathy, including our natural compassion. And so you see this healthy resistance. And then I guess what we'll talk about on this panel is how to support that. So it's not really about coming in and teaching boys something that we've discovered is a good thing for them. They are born wanting and knowing how to do this. So how can we keep it so that their socialization and societal messages and pressures don't kind of pressure and lead them away from these things they feel to be valuable and that actually really are, and we have been proven to be essential to their health and happiness.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mary, would you like to chime in?
So, building on Judy, yes, sure. Building on what Judy shared, I would just like to focus on the idea of empathy as something that is innate, but blooms or fades in the first couple of years based on the attachment relationship. And Judy followed Stern's research, which is very interesting, which is also the attachment relationship. When I say empathy, I appreciated your definition of compassion, Daniel. Empathy, in my context, is very simple. It's the ability to understand what others feel, but to be able to feel with them. And it's got a cognitive affect as well, emotion side of it. So little boys have the capacity in the work we've done, and I'm talking to understand their societal role as a protector. And that sometimes gets them into the role of being the aggressor and being violent, and they have to protect their any slight against their masculinity. They feel they have to respond with a physical or a nasty comment. And when children collectively in a group, just as Paul gave a great historical context of how we evolved to this place where we are now from a hunter-gatherer perspective, we are now learning in clusters of about 20 to 25 in our childhood. That's it. Kids are boxed into rooms of about 20 to 25 children with one person overseeing, and there's a group norm. And we have a chance to shift that group norm within those boxes. Exactly. And that's what we can do, and we've proven we can do it. So working with well over 1 million youngsters, boys and girls equally, it's very beautiful to be able to see after a whole
I can't wait.
year of interacting with a tiny baby in their first year of life that they feel their own humanity. And that is essential for what we're all talking about, is how do we deal with the reality of the general concept. That's enough for now, but boy, it'd be grand to delve into all of these issues you brought up, Daniel.
Yes. Well, actually, one thing that struck me in our conversation, Mary, was I asked you in your work of roots of empathy, if I understand correctly, it's like from children from 4 to 9 years old. Is that correct? Well, but I asked you
No,
if you.
up to grade 8, they're about 13.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. But one of the things that you told me that really struck me was that you saw the greatest gender differences between in older boys, that older boys actually got it. They not that girls didn't, but generally girls get it quicker when it comes to empathy. I mean, let's face that. And it's maybe some natural wiring, but certainly some social conditioning there. But that the older
Yes.
boys actually got more in touch with their little child, their vulnerability by being in relationship to the little baby, and that changed them.
Yes, we saw the biggest change in attitude and behavior in the boys who are most alienated or most aggressive or bullies. And, I'll share one quick story with you, Daniel. There was a boy in a grade 8 class, and he was at least a head taller than the other children because when he was 4, his mother was murdered in front of his eyes. And basically, everyone in his family was in jail or unavailable. So he kept being passed from foster care home to foster care home. He couldn't tell you how many homes he'd been in. So his way of protecting himself was to look very aggressive. This is late 90s. He had shaved the back of his head. He had a ponytail at the top, had a tattoo at the back of his head. Young kids did not do that then in elementary school. Anyhow, he arrived in grade 8 at the Roots of Empathy program. And initially, he didn't connect with the baby. But when he finally started connecting with the baby, the mother said at one class, would anybody like to try on the baby carrier? And this is like a snuggly. And didn't our hero say he would like to try it on? And everyone was amazed. So he was presented then with the baby. The Roots of Empathy instructor said, would you like to put the baby in the snuggly? And he said yes, and the mother looked mildly horrified. So anyhow, he put the baby chest to chest, and the mother had just explained that she wanted a cuddly baby, but she got a very independent baby who only wanted to face out in the snuggly, didn't want to snuggle. So he put the baby chest to chest, and the baby molded to him. So he went off in the corner and he put his arms around the outside of the baby in the snuggly, and he was doing this seasick rock that he watched the mother do. Now, this is a boy who said no mothering. And he came back a few minutes later and he passed the baby gently back to the mother. And he said to the Roots of Empathy instructor, do you think that if no one has ever loved you, that you could still be a good father? So for him, there was a big switch that he suddenly saw himself as a human being who, although he hadn't experienced love, believed he could love.
Beautiful. That is, thank you, Mary. That's a beautiful story. It's really amazing that we teach boys. I hate to say we, but as a world, teach boys to deny their basic humanity. And as Judy was saying before, the connection piece of that, because we're wired to connect. So it's really insane. And when you think about how we're constantly trying to navigate our environment, certainly one of the major things we do is we try to fit in. Like if you don't fit into the tribe, if you're not part of the tribe, What's the worst thing that can happen? You get tossed out of the tribe. If you get tossed out of the tribe, what happens? It's a death sentence. So we are literally wired unconsciously to make sure that we fit in, to conform to the contexts in which we live. And part of what happens with males is you have to keep conforming, as you were saying, Judy, to these crazy contexts in order to fit in. And yet at the same time, when we're fitting in, we're leaving ourselves out. And so I'd really love to see how do we like very specifically, pragmatically create programs? Because I'll just tell you that part of what we're looking at MBCI, which is short for Men and Boys Compassion Initiative, is how do we intervene? Like, what are the programs that we want to support? We definitely want to support Roots of Empathy, for sure. But we're really, really looking at how to make a difference. The next panel, by the way, is boys in school. And we're going to be looking, when you were saying before, Mary, about one teacher, 25 people, what happens with boys in school. It's not a pretty picture, so I hope the rest of you will tune into that. But what do we actually do to make a difference on small levels, on large levels?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what Mary and Judy said is phenomenally important, because it's not about creating compassion. Compassion already exists. It's understanding what turns it off. I mean, we are doing a lot of studies in callousness and cruelty, the two enemies of compassion, if you want, and the way in which societies train boys to be callous to themselves, not to notice their own pain and suffering, and to be callous to the pain and suffering they cause other people. Whether it's your big, fossil fuel industries that don't care two hoots about the damage they're doing, all the way up through all of the leaders who don't really care about the harm that they cause, provided they are advanced and so on. So, you and I have talked about this, Daniel. So the key thing is it's not just continuing to facilitate compassion. That's really important. But how do we deal with the inhibitors? How do we deal with stealers of compassion, those that would drive us into callousness and turning off our concern with suffering? I mean, that's something, we've done a lot of work in the prisons, and that's something we're very interested in. But those are the key issues, because I think, as Mary and Judy say, you can foster compassion. It's there. We're wired for it, as you say, but we live in societies that actually seem to have a vested interest in turning that off.
Yes, and one of the things that I know that you've explored, Paul, and I think everyone here can contribute to, is in terms of inhibitors, is shame.
Yeah.
Shame is a very powerful human force. And when you think about like a boy who's like very expressive and like, hi, and all of a sudden he's just like, can I touch you? Can I connect you? And go, oh God, you seem really like uncool. Like you're so uncool for doing that, and getting these kind of shaming comments. What happens then? When your natural enthusiasm, like etymologically means to be filled with God, your godliness, even they shamed, and then you learn to start battening down the hatches and pulling in and tightening up, and it leads into this kind of tightness, emotional tightness and constriction that we see in many males, and it's very much shame-based. I don't think we're dealing with how powerful shame is as a force in controlling people in general. We can control whole cultures through shame and threats. How do we shift this dynamic? I know I'm asking you very softball questions. Am I not?
Was that directed to me or to everybody?
It's directed to everyone.
Yeah.
But if you would like to take it, feel free.
Okay. Well, I think shame is the being inferiorized, isn't it? There is such a word. It's being looked down on, being made to feel deficient and so forth. So you're quite right about that. And the issue that we have is because we live in very competitive societies, not egalitarian societies, very unjust societies. We know that some people who are not able to compete, they end up poor or whatever. And we also, as you know, we have a media, social media and entertainment that's very keen on male violence. A lot of excitement in the Hollywood and all that is all the good guys sort of beating up on the bad guys, all this sort of stuff. So shame is rooted into a sort of a social narrative about competing and how to compete. And if you're going to compete, you're going to put yourself first and not worry about the consequences for other people of your success. So we have to address that, Dan, and that's going to take a lot of thinking about how can we address this tendency to support competitiveness, and that people don't need to worry about the consequences of their striving to success that they have on other people.
You know, one thing I do want to throw in here before we hear from Mary and Judy is I remember in a conversation we had a while ago, Paul, that you said something to me that got me thinking, and I've thought about it a lot since then, that culturally there's a term of toxic masculinity, you know, which has been thrown around ad nauseum, and it's quite disturbing there. And you use the term toxic competitiveness.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, which is mainly done by males. It's certainly done by females, you know, as well. But I think that that's a much better way of looking at it, because part of the blowback against, you know, I think looking at some of these gender dynamics is by calling it toxic masculinity. A lot of guys are taking like, you're calling me toxic. You're saying masculinity is a part of who I am and I'm toxic. Like, that's very, very bad branding if we want to create change, you know.
Yeah.
And so toxic competitiveness, I believe, is right. I think that's the best way of looking at it. And how do we start shifting that? You know, because competitiveness is interesting, because on the one hand, you have toxic competitiveness is like kind of kill at all costs in a certain way, but that's actually not the etymology of competition. The word competition comes from the Latin competere, which means to strive together. You use each other to grow. That's what's beautiful about sports. In the best case scenario, sure, someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. But if you can hug it out afterward, you know, and just inspire each other, because it's really when people are playing at the top of their game, and I'm not just talking about sports, I'm talking about in life, when you're really showing up and you can bring out the best and you make people think more, you make people become bigger and stronger, you know, in a way it's beautiful and inspiring.
Yeah, perfect.
I think that shift, if I can,
Please.
Daniel, what you and Paul both put in, I really love that. First of all, I don't like the term toxic masculinity, because exactly, it's a very slippery slope to saying that somehow boys and men are toxic, and I don't believe that to be the case at all. I think that looking at more contextually the competitiveness, but I would say to even pull it even farther, sometimes I've talked about, like, if anything is toxic or harmful, it's the socialization, or it's the social structure, or the systems that we have in place. And what's harmful about it is this kind of hierarchy. So competition, I agree with you, Daniel. Competition in and of itself is not a problem, because even though there are winners and losers, everyone is improving. Everyone's getting better, and they're having the experience of competing, which can be gratifying in itself. So it's not just the end goal of who walks away with the trophy, but it's everybody striving to do better and to learn and to, you know, grow together in that sense. And so I think it's more about this hierarchy, especially within a paradigm that says it's zero sum, and my gain comes at your cost. Not that we can both gain together and make improvements on our own, in compared to ourselves, but that my gain necessitates someone else's loss. That's a problem. And the idea that there's a kind of limitation, there's limit. Only a few people can have worth. Only a few people can have love. In that case, it creates this kind of a negative competition, because you're feeling like there's scarcity, and scarcity creates anxiety, and it creates distrust, and it kind of runs counter to all the things you're trying to build with the compassion coalition. So to come back to something Paul said earlier too, and in terms of like the primates, and Frans de Waal wrote The Age of Empathy. and said that although we tend to focus on, because we always find what we look for, we focus on violence, we focus on aggression, we say, oh gosh, that's just human nature, primate nature, that's what we were built for. But our species would not have survived without cooperation, without communities that were based on trust and working together and really building things together. And so that's also there. But again, because it gets, associated with femininity, then it's seen as somehow weaker or not as valuable. But without that, we would not have made it as, in all the things that are good about where we stand. And I feel like, even though we have a lot of challenges that we face politically, historically, socially, all these things, there are a lot of good things in people that Mary's program definitely highlights and fosters and facilitates. And we can turn to those as we're trying to think about how to scale up these efforts to really support boys and men to have healthier developmental trajectories and healthier lives and less loneliness and less struggle.
Speaking of scaling, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how do we scale? And Mary, would you like to take that on? How do we actually scale empathy, compassion?
Well, where is the population that we want best to reach? We want to start early. We want to start upstream rather than downstream. So upstream is public education, at which we can reach children. All of you actually, that I'd like to pick up on is the notion of, and if you look at how teaching and learning, they are the toxic stuff, not the people. I agree with Judy. It's not people who are toxic, but sometimes our approaches to teaching children are shame-based. So your name goes up on the board if you haven't read a certain number of books because of pizza. So it is a very basic, dishonest, unfair competition, and the whole idea of teaching through fear. It starts when children are toddlers. It's not just boys, but somehow or other, the boys have managed to collect more of the shame in this process because girls tend to be more compliant. And compliant is dangerous. You're at higher risk for sexual abuse as a child if you're very compliant, whether you're a girl or a boy. It's easier to teach a child that's compliant. You don't learn as well if you're compliant. So there is a balance in education or any groups of children on how we look at competition. Really, I feel it's about intrinsic motivation is where the key is. The secret sauce is that if we allow children to understand that the most important decision that they make is what they think of themselves, not how others value, not impressing people, not having the loudest voice, being the fastest runner, but your own character, oneself. And the world conspires against all of that. And so I think the shame-based learning and the idea of children are afraid not to succeed. It's so destructive. It doesn't allow, as you were saying earlier, Judy, any child to feel authentic. So they're denying their feelings. They don't want to cry, no matter how hurt they are. The boys don't want to cry in school because somehow or other that's a stain on their masculinity. So I think all of these concepts are broader than what we're talking about. They're deep, they're part of society. And so to your question then, how do we scale compassion, or how do we scale empathy, or how do we scale healthy living for men and for boys? We go to where the people are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fantastic, Mary. I mean, one of the things I would do is I'd get producers of Hollywood, I'd target them, and I'd say, you are making films that actually are toxic competitive, right?
Exactly.
Why don't you make films that show they're going to be exciting, that's okay, but actually bring out the cooperation, the compassion between people, how compassion saves people. You can do all kinds of movies where it's the helpfulness and the bravery of each other that's, and makes a contribution that way. So it really is targeting different groups that have power to shape values. So targeting these different groups and saying it's time we actually create a society that valued cooperative, compassionate acts, which sometimes involves self-sacrifice and great bravery. We often say to guys, have you ever heard of firefighters? They will risk their lives to save you. Don't say men don't have compassion, because they do. I mean, women do it too. We've got female firefighters now. But this idea that men can't be compassionate, they can, but you have to give them the context. You have to value it. You have to see it as an opportunity in which you can make a contribution. Then men like that.
I'm all for everything you're saying, and I'm really thinking about in terms of changing the paradigm.
Yeah,
we really need role models to be leading the way. And I think that when we look at generally athletes and actors, like that's those, not so much politicians, even increasingly so.
But I think that
let me just say one last thing. No worries, Judy. One last thing about this, which is that how do we actually encourage this? Just to say that in terms of what you were saying at the moment, but in terms of Hollywood, I'm in contact now with someone who is a part of what's called the Hollywood Compassion Coalition, right? And so actually, Rick and I have been emailing with this gentleman, and we really want to.
There's an oxymoron,
right? Right, and so we are speaking with like the Man Enough Network, who is Justin Baldoni, and really looking at basically we're changing the paradigm about what it means to be a cool man, right? So it's not just acceptable, like what's cool, because we know that people are driven by many different cognitive biases: conformity bias, you want to fit in, and prestige bias, you want to stand out in a good way, right? And so if prestige is such that compassion is connected to prestige, hey, that's a winning formula.
Yeah, that's
Judy,
right.
you were going to say something.
Oh, no, I was just going to piggyback on what you were saying about, role models. And you'd mentioned absolutely, athletes and actors, but also just everyday people, because, the Ms. Foundation a couple decades ago came up with this idea of, men wearing buttons, just as a reminder, you are, a child is watching you, a boy is watching you. What is he learning about what it means to be a man, what it means to be compassionate? Or if you're a woman identifying, then what does it mean to be a woman? And so we are all role models, and to kind of remind people that the kids in our lives and the kids that we encounter on the street see what we are doing. It kind of reminds us to kind of, not to put pressure to be perfect all the time, but actually to allow us to feel like there's something valuable in modeling a whole range of behaviors. They need to see from all kinds of people that, everyone can care, permission to care. I think that's one thing that's often denied to boys and men. Obviously they care, but they learn as part of their socialization to put kind of feign indifference as a part of being cool.
Right.
And one thing that Justin Baldoni does really well is he puts his vulnerability and his obvious, care and concern and his love for his family and for other people. He puts that right out front, and he says, look at, and it takes bravery and it takes courage, and it models for a lot of boys. It gives them permission to say, oh yeah, I feel that too. Again, building on Mary and the emphasis on empathy, is like they can relate to that. They see that and they say, oh yeah, I have that in me too. And oh, it's okay to value that and to nurture that, and to use that as a basis for feeling good about myself. And so to give them access. You were saying earlier about kind of how we kind of siphon off who gets to be what. And I'd mentioned to you before, Terry Real, who works with couples and with families, he's talked about how when we divide the full range of human capacities into masculine and feminine and say that only male identifying people can be masculine and only female identifying can be feminine, then everyone loses because everyone has to cut themselves off for the sake of being appropriate. And similarly with what you're saying about proving masculinity, that starts from the premise that you are not already enough.
Right.
And I think that puts so much pressure and this creates unnecessary anxiety and self-doubt that we don't need that. Life is challenging enough, right? And so if we can start from a different premise and say, let kids know they are enough and just for who they are, not necessarily for what they managed to achieve and accomplish and prove to other people, I think that would really move us towards this kind of more compassionate and empathetic society that we strive and hope for.
Well put. Would anyone like to add to what Judy has just said?
Judy, to build on what you're saying there. Well, I think I'm out of sync here in timing, but I would like to add and to say that anywhere where children show up in a group, there are opportunities to treat them as people rather than girls or boys. And in schools, traditionally, we're trained to have the girls line up on one side and the boys line up on another side. And for many, many reasons, that's counterproductive. But if we have discussions, as we do in Roots of Empathy, around a baby sitting on a green blanket and trying to understand what that baby is feeling and hearing the other classmates say what they think the baby is feeling, the children have a rare opportunity to understand where another person is coming from in their feelings. And it's not about gender. And very often the children will attribute to this little baby what they are feeling. And it's so fascinating when the instructor flips it back to the children. When was a time that you felt like the baby? The children have an unparalleled opportunity to hear the authentic sharing of boys, girls, and whomever around feelings. And it legitimizes feelings. It doesn't genderize feelings. It means that we are all on a continuum and that we can understand our shared humanity. And if we can start changing the world classroom by classroom, given that children become emotionally literate, it will make a huge difference to what you're talking about, scaling all of these concepts so that we can have a world where everybody feels a place has been set at the table for them.
Beautifully put. And I do wonder how we elevate compassion as a super cool, notable, worthy endeavor, as opposed to callousness and cruelty, as Paul was talking about before. Because, if we don't breathe into compassion, we will be left with callousness and cruelty. It's pretty much that simple. And so it seems, I think for all of us here, and I'm imagining for all of you who are listening to this, pretty obvious that we need more compassion in this world. I mean, it couldn't be more obvious, I don't think, but maybe that's me. But I am still struck by the level of domination and take no prisoners and the Andrew Tates, of the world, taking control. Because if we don't influence and inform these younger people, and not just younger people, we're talking about adolescents and young adults and just in general, they are going to be drawn into the dark web, and many of them are, because there's a lot of horrible things that are happening on the internet and have been happening for years, these communities that really support hatred and violence. And as Paul was saying in your introductory comments, that this is part of the human condition. We are, we can go in a multitude of different directions. There in Buddhism, they talk about the heaven realms and the hell realms, and this planet is kind of an amalgam, of the heaven realms and the hell realms, and there's a bit of a battle, shall we say, going on. I mean, certainly you look globally right now, and hate crimes are on the rise, and we have to really face this. And I think for each of us, how do we work with our own hatred? And I'm not immune to hatred. I'll just say that I've had a lot of hatred in my life, and I get reactive, and I know that part. But I'm wondering what you all think about how do you actually work with your own nervous systems, in a way, because part of what goes on is kind of neurophysiologically, just when you're reactive mode, when you're in threat mode, we're all very different when we're in threat mode than when we're in thrive mode. And we only have a few minutes left. So if you can take a quick little glance, or a quick little statement about how do we actually make some difference in moving from more threat to thrive?
Well, very briefly, I think that's such an important point. There's a lot of stuff about compassion and happiness and love and all that. That's okay. You can do that. But actually, the most important thing about compassion is it stands against suffering. It stands against the dark side, right? We have a terrible dark side. Compassion is the courage and the wisdom to say no to that. We will not be creators of suffering. We will try to uproot the causes of suffering, which is to do with what's going on in this evolved brain in certain contexts. So compassion needs to be seen as a courageous pursuit, a wise pursuit against the parts of ourselves that can be so harmful. And happiness will come out of that, but it's basically a courageous wisdom to address the part of ourselves that can easily cause suffering.
Thank you, Paul. Judy?
No, I agree completely with what Paul says. I mean, to kind of, if needed, repackage it as a strength. I don't know why it would ever become seen as a weakness or not a strength, but just to kind of really emphasize that this is, as Paul said, it's heroic. It takes courage. It takes wisdom to make that choice. It's violence or anything darker is an easier, lazier choice, and sometimes people don't have options, and I understand that it's complicated, but it's really, again, just repackaging if need be, as needed, as a positive strength that serves people well in all aspects of their lives.
God, Mary, I can see a new bumper sticker coming from this. Violence is lazy. I like it. All right, Mary.
Well, it's also cowardly. Yeah.
Sorry, what?
I would also add it's cowardly. And in Roots of
Beautiful.
Empathy, we tell children that it takes moral courage to stand up and to challenge injustice or of any kind. And our view is that empathy encompasses the ability to feel with the other on all the emotions, joy, and not just suffering, but for compassion. I feel it takes empathy in order to be beautifully compassionate. And I don't know that the Dalai Lama and I agree on that, but I bow to all the experience that Paul has in this world on compassion. And I think if we could just raise empathic children, we would have more compassion in the world.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that struck me in our conversation, Mary, was as you were speaking about empathy, and I know that you use the word empathy, and we've been using the word compassion. I left our conversation, with thinking about that quite a lot, actually, and thinking about how when you're feeling with, kind of the natural movement is to take action. Now, that's different from the way empathy is defined in some quarters, where like empathy is just feeling with, and you could be like a mass murderer to feel with which is a horrible thought. But I think that's far more the anomaly than the reality of how people are actually wired, that to actually feel what is it like to be that person, and to even ask that question. what is it like? And I think that it would be best for all of us to be looking at that. And I know we're coming to the end of our time. Any last words, quick last words by any of you are welcome.
No, but I think that's important on empathy, isn't it? If that were me, if you think about Gaza, if that were me, you think about Ukraine, if that were me, if that were my
Exactly.
family, if that were me, that ability to think about the other, if that were me, and that is what stirs compassion. You know, if that was my family, my wife, or whatever, if that were me. So that key issue in compassion, empathy is if that were me.
Beautiful. Any last words by you? No expectation, just welcome.
I guess my final, well, I guess where I am at the moment is the I and thou, Martin Buber, has been wafting through
Right.
all of these discussions. How
Beautiful.
very simple that we connect the I and thou as a philosophy.
And just to say one thing about that, thank you for raising that, Mary. When Buber spoke about the I, he spoke about the I, thou, and the I, it. And one of the things that most important point was that the I in an I, thou relation is very different from the I in an I, it relationship. You know, because then you're an object.
Yeah.
You're an object yourself when you view other
Mhm.
people as objects. You're a subject when you view
Mhm.
other people as subjects.
Great point.
Judy, any last word?
If I start, I won't stop. So I think everyone said it so well. I'll just let it sit right there, and really positive.
Well, thank you for your compassion. Well, thank you all very much. I so appreciate all of you. You're all doing great work in the world, and I recommend all of our listeners tune in and take note of all the great work all three of you are doing. So thank you very much, and to be continued.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for the organization. That's brilliant.
Thank you.
You're doing incredibly well.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to introduce our next panel now, which is Boys in School. The Boys in School Task Force began as a task force in Division 51, which is a division of the American Psychological Association. I had the good fortune of being president of the division at the time that it began, and did sit in on some meetings. These are wonderful people who are part of this very, very important task force, and I'm sure that they will be brought on very shortly. All right. Great. Welcome, guys. How art thou? Good to see you all.
That well, Daniel. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing okay, considering having had a concussion a few days ago. I'm shockingly, at least semi-cogent. Not that I'm always cogent anyway. So I want to just ask you, like, what is the Boys in School Task Force? How did it begin? What's the primary purpose or purposes of that? I'm going to ask it generally. Sometimes I'll ask one of you a specific question, but that's thrown out to all of you.
I can start. Are we live right now?
We are live right now, and by the way, here I was, jumping ahead. This is Chris Regaluth, who is the chair or co-chair, of this, and teaches, a wonderful human being, and is a great psychologist. And Matt Engler Carlson, who teaches at Cal State Northridge, who does a lot of work. Not Cal State Northridge.
Fullerton.
Cal State. They're all the same to me, right?
Yeah.
So sorry about that. And Bentara Morton, who teaches at University of South Alabama, and Saeed Hill, who is my dear mentee, who was teaching at Northwestern and is now out on his own, teaches a lot about masculinity. So you're all delightful human beings. Super happy to be with you. Okay, so tell us about the purpose or purposes of the Boys in School Task Force.
So the purpose is to, one, build awareness of this really decades-long issue of boys underperforming in school and boys not reaching their potential. That can be academically, but that can also just be general engagement in the community that schools have. And part of the work is pointing to the reality that boys of color are even more marginalized in that environment, not surprisingly. And then we also try to come up with, in addition to awareness building, support for educators with things that they can do to improve the situation.
Great. Anyone else like to add to that?
Yeah, I was gonna add very quickly. And hey, folks, glad to be here with everybody. Yeah, I mean, I think the original idea too of the task force, I believe it was like in 2020 at this point, in the midst of the pandemic. But this idea of how it was a back and forth from what I remember on a listserv just about the education that girls typically get in schools. Very direct education about gender in particular and the impact of gender on them and that sort of thing and the systems of gender. And the realization that boys, we don't really get socialized in those ways to understand and unpack our gender and unpack what it means to be male or masculine or masculinities. What does that look like? And so it was a way of how do we address this with parents? How do we address this with teachers, administrators, anybody who has access with students, with boys in particular? We really want to target them for our educational purposes with our boys. And so we really wanted to do more of that work.
Great.
I'm going to add on to what you just said is, and what he says has great impact for boys' achievement in schools. And it has for some time, meaning that they've, as Chris said, that underperforming, this inability for boys to reach their potential is not a new thing. It got highlighted in the pandemic as things began to get worse. And it seems like now we're beginning to talk about it, but it's not like this is a new thing, right? And so what Saeed was saying is that, as in the larger world, gender matters, but particularly in organizational settings like school systems, K-12 in particular, being a boy has not shown to lead to better outcomes.
Did you want to add anything, Bentra? No expectation.
No, I think they've covered a great deal about why we were started and kind of what our main goals are.
Great. I want to. One of the great things that you all have done is you've created some wonderful white papers. You can see those white papers, but by going on the Division 51 website, APA Division 51 website, and maybe we'll put some. Maybe you can put something in the chat to say, give a link to that, or we can send that information out after the event. But I want to quote from one of your white papers, and I'd love to hear you guys comment on it. Boys are commonly socialized to restrict vulnerable emotions, display power and aggression, and prioritize sports while devaluing academics. Consequently, adherence to the boy-guy code, and we spoke about this in the last panel, boy-guy code, along with the experience that their presence and contributions are not as valued, can contribute to many boys' misbehavior and disengagement from school and educators. Who would like to weigh in on that quote and kind of take off on that and give us a little more of a sense, put some flesh on the body of that?
It's my quote, so I'm going to let one of you all start.
And then we'll go to the source.
So I think the quote really gives us a chance to realize that there are parts of humanity or boyhood that are not as privileged or not welcomed in the mainstream idea of what it means to go to school in public area. So if I were to go to school and be strong at reading, in many places I had to hide the reading abilities and skills that I had around because that was something that was not welcomed in our community or in the school around. I was a kid who understood things very quickly, was able to move quickly through the academic knowledge, but that also took away from the street knowledge that was there, or they were not always seen as equal. And so, in one space, you have to engage in this academic piece about who I am, what kinds of things I do academically, but also how I engage with the things around me through my emotions in one way that I may be able to show them in another environment that I'm not be able to show them. And so that's kind of part of that quote that's there that spoke to me about like how do we keep the two parts of our bodies and not being able to live as a one part of who we are all in one time.
Benjamin, I'm curious. So what I'm hearing on some level is that being academically minded, at least in certain communities, and maybe in your experience, was potentially a source of shame. Like if you were exposing yourself, so to speak, as being academically oriented, like that wouldn't be cool. Like that wouldn't be acceptable. It wouldn't be a conformist thing to do in terms of the male mentality. Did I understand that accurately?
So it's not an idea of shame. It is something that's not understood. And I think that's a better way of picturing it as opposed to shame. I don't think anybody was ashamed of the academic prowess. And in many areas, I found lots of support. At the same time, it also disenfranchised me from my own community because there was a uniqueness or idea of there's a certain type of knowledge that Bentara may have through book knowledge that may not be as common because many of the people in our communities or in different communities that I engage with or along the way went to different types of school. I chose or was sent to a school on a different side of the county from where my home school was or where the people in my community went to school. So there's a different type of educational opportunities that I was afforded that allowed me to work in one environment. And at times I had to have dual identities to work in both environments or in multiple environments.
Great, thank you. All right, so who else would like to weigh in on that quote until we get to the source?
Yeah, Daniel, I might add that what you alluded to the boy code earlier, and from my understanding, there's not a part of the boy code that says be smart. There's an element around kind of being in control. There's elements around being independent. There's elements around kind of looking like you're the big man on campus, so to speak, right? A lot of restrictive kind of elements. But as Benjamin kind of said, necessarily being smart isn't part of that. Like you can show your masculinity, so to speak, in other settings. And I think what happens in school sometimes is that, again, there may not be a lot of strokes for being intelligent or being smart or being successful. And the opposite of that. So when you're not successful or when acting out behaviors gets you in trouble, right? The boy code kind of says to show that you're in charge and to save face. And one of the greatest ways to save face is to say, I don't care about this.
Right.
You can't hurt me, right? So I don't care what happens in this classroom. I don't care about the grade. You're going to kick me out. I wanted to leave anyway, right? And so there's ways in which that kind of happens at a systemic level, right? That makes, in some ways, the classroom an unwelcome place for many boys.
I think something that may be confusing for a lot of people has to do with maybe the delta or difference between being smart and being successful, because certainly success has been associated with men need to be successful. So how does that work? That kind of dynamic, because it seems like being smart kind of to some degree leads to success, but somehow that's not okay. Something doesn't make sense logically, but I'm sure it does. Can you speak to that?
Well, and you know, the boy code and the guy code doesn't all fully make sense, right? It doesn't make sense that there would be a norm of emotional restriction when we're emotional beings, right? All of us. And little boys are very emotionally vulnerable in such beautiful ways. It doesn't make sense that there would be a norm that so strongly prioritizes sports over school for boys when school is a place that they have to go 5 days a week starting in kindergarten for 13 years, for 10 months of the year. It's a setup. And so lots of the boy code doesn't make sense. A little bit more to your question, though, I mean, part of what can happen in the dominant societal fabric with boys and men and with the pressures, and you know, the pressures are fairly consistent. All boys and men get exposed to them, but what comes out on the other end is very diverse, right? Boys and men have lots of ways of appearing and being and presenting themselves, right? But there can be this pressure to be successful, but not to seem like you're trying hard, not to seem like you're putting in effort. And school asks you to put in effort.
It's so interesting because one of the things that you hear on the sports field is putting an effort. Like
Right.
he's not putting in enough effort. So you're saying like the exact opposite in school.
And so that is a context, right, where effort's okay. And you know, athletes who can perform at incredibly high levels and don't have to work as hard, right, but are at the pinnacle, get glorified even more.
Right. Right.
If I could, Daniel, I was just going to add, you know, I think a big part of this is also a lot of unlearning on the part of just us as adults now navigating a world where we're trying to help raise children, raise kids, and as administrators, psychologists, mental health professionals, whatever it may be. I think it takes a lot more curiosity about our boys than we've ever shown. I think we typically want to put people obviously in our rigid gender boxes. That's where we get our restrictive masculinities from, right? These rigid ways of having to be, but also rigid ways of being students, rigid ways of it has to be this. We're very regimented. You sit down at these times and you stand up at these times, you go outside at these times, right? And regiment, you know, scheduling is great for kids in that way. But when children do veer off of that, and we know many of our boys, some of the issues we have with our boys tends to be about energy and you know, being up and wanting to be a little bit more physical or moving around a little bit. We have administrators, teachers, guardians, parents who maybe squash that, who don't really show a lot of curiosity about that. I remember me as a boy talking all the time to peers around me. All of my messages home, Syed takes others off task, right? Syed won't stop talking. And I got in trouble all of the time. And that trouble, you know, isolated me from my peers because I'd be put in time out. And my parents would always say, like, what are you ever going to do where you're always talking to people, you know, like this? And, you know, here I am as a psychologist, and, you know, I'm doing outreach and education. But it's one of those things where maybe if I had people, and to Bentor's point a little bit earlier, you know, even people who look like me in context or had similar backgrounds than me, what would that do if someone showed me that kind of curiosity and care, as opposed to punish me for it, right? And I think that that's something we also have to grapple with. What are the ways that we need to unlearn as adults in our children's lives as well?
Right. Well, one thing I wonder about is really the role of compassion and really self-compassion here. Like we haven't talked about that yet, but it's a subtext. And obviously, when we look at the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative and the Global Compassion Coalition, we're highlighting compassion as a very important modality, way of being. And I haven't heard that word mentioned here. And obviously, there's some challenges there. What is your experience when you look at the role of compassion from teachers, from administrators, from parents, when it comes to the boy challenges we see?
I'll go. It was funny. I was just thinking that as Saeed was speaking directly, that I think that scenario that Saeed talks about is a challenge for boys, because I think that I have a lot of respect for teachers and for educators. They work incredibly hard. They're overworked in school settings with too many students in the classes and a lot of demands. Like I said earlier, we have decades of research that suggests that boys have been struggling, which speaks to the fact that systemically, I think in many ways, kind of what is working isn't necessarily working for boys. And one of the things that we know is that, you know, boys tend to get in trouble in terms of externalizing behavior and acting out. And when you have a history of kind of lack of performance and acting out, I think stereotypes get created in terms of kind of who boys are in the classroom. And it's hard to see beyond that stereotype sometimes. Meaning that as was said earlier, you know, there's a myriad of ways in which boys show up. There's a myriad of ways in which boys understand what masculinity is, and they're not necessarily all aligned with the boy code. But it's really easy in some ways to miscode that, to kind of, when you see something as acting out, it's just another example of the boy misbehaving. And the notion of curiosity, which I think Saeed said earlier too, is like having a much more curious and broad understanding of kind of who boys are, I think is absolutely required, because in the absence of that, it tends to confirm biases we have. And the biases, and just to be clear, like the biases in some ways, you know, come from experiences, and the biases in some ways are played out by decades of research that says that boys are underperforming in schools. And so the bias can be that boys don't want to be here, that boys can't be here, and boys can't be successful in some capacity. And so when we see the acting out, it just confirms kind of what we believe, right? And it plays into other biases we have in terms of kind of the intersectionality of boys as well, and what we kind of experience. So that compassion piece, is many ways, is to kind of have a much broader view of boys. And that is a larger challenge, right? That's why you're having a day like today. It isn't just about boys, it's about males across the lifespan.
Exactly.
In the sense that kind of understanding that there's, you know, there's a lot more than meets the eye, right? And there's a lot more happening behind the scenes than what is being shown. And if we go back to think about kind of how the boy code plays into that, right? The boy code is about appearance in many ways. It's about showing, you know, not the teacher. The boy code is about the other boys in the classroom. That's who he is performing for, right? And what he's kind of showing is that, again, like, he is in control, he's independent, he's saving face, right? And that may not be actually what's happening behind. And I think the four of us could say that our experiences with boys is that absolutely that's not what's happening behind. That boys are loving and compassionate and care about a lot of things, right? But in the absence of kind of having the success, or believing the environment cares about you, it's much easier just to kind of say, I'll check out, right? And so that compassion is this notion around how do we begin to have a much broader understanding in terms of kind of who boys are.
Right. You know, I'm really struck, Matt, by your word, which I had never heard before, of miscoding. You know, and because that now I'm thinking, I mentioned a bumper sticker in the last panel, like miscoding boys or something. But I wonder about that, you know, because on the one hand, when we think about like Jungian psychology, not to go too far into this territory, I think about the whole idea of the persona, the mask, like the mask you live in, the how we want to be seen, versus the shadow, you know, about how we actually are, you know, in some way that has a way of coming out despite our best efforts, so to speak. And I wonder about, how does that come out in boys? Because you're talking about this, I think you're all talking about this very intense dynamic between that the outside of boys and what comes out is very confusing, I think, to a lot of people, like what's really going on in there, because on some level their full humanity hasn't been welcomed. And I think it's just natural when full humanity hasn't been welcomed, that there's going to be some resistance, you know, to showing up. I mean, we think about how, we want boys on some level, I'm sure all of us do, want boys to be more emotional in the sense of more sensitive. Like sensitivity is cool. We're trying to create new memes. Like it's cool to be sensitive rather than, oh, you're too sensitive, man. Like, oh man, you get hurt so easily. Like when actually we do get hurt easily. I get hurt easily. I've been as a kid, my God, I know I had to pull it in myself because I'd be shamed if I showed too much, like that hurt my feelings, type thing. So I wonder, how do we sort to shift that dynamic in school where boys are kind of on some level welcomed and honored and acknowledged for being vulnerable? Because vulnerability is a part of life. I mean, let's face it, we're all going to die on some level, hopefully not today, but I mean, it is a fundamental part of life that we human beings have vulnerabilities, physical, emotional, psychological vulnerabilities. And yet when we're taught to somehow you shouldn't be vulnerable and you have to stuff it all and keep it all in, somehow it comes out. It comes out actually through the shadow. And so what do we do? I realize I'm saying a whole bunch here, but I wonder, how do we on some level change the paradigm for boys in general, but obviously it's going to be boys in school, which is our focus today. How do we change the paradigm on a kind of multi-systemically? Because it's not just going to be parents telling their sons that they can be more emotional, right? That's great, and I think we need to support parents to do that. But if they are and they show their real vulnerabilities in school, and the other students are shaming toward that, and the teachers are not accepting of it, and the administrators. So it's a very complex challenge, and we have to deal with it multi-systemically. And I'm curious how any of you would like to weigh in on this rather large territory.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and I'll at least give an example. And I'd love to hear what everyone else has to say, but I'll give an example of a program that we do, which I think is a good tee up for this. Is so in Chicago, where I have been the previous 6 years, we have the Camp Kumba program, which is between ages 8 and 16 year old boys in particular, who are all Black and brown boys in the city of Chicago. And we do an exercise with these boys that we recruit to an after school program, which we can always go into all the details another time about it. But essentially, we have an exercise called the mask activity, where what we do is I'll physically print off silhouettes of a mask and pass it out, like paper mask, and pass it out to all of our boys in our groups, and have them write on the front of the masks words and phrases that they think portray who people see them as. So when people see you, how do they experience you? What do they see? And so, for example, I might write things about, people can't see me right now, but I'm a pretty short man. I'm like 5'2", 6'2" on a good day, right? But I'm, probably about 5'2", and I might write the word short on there. I might write something about my race. Maybe weird. Maybe there's something weird about me that people say, and I might write that on the mask. Who knows, right? Things that I portray to the world and the world sees in me. But then on the inside of the mask, I have them write words and phrases that describe things that they don't allow people to see. Things about like, oh, I feel lonely sometimes, or scared sometimes, or whatever it may be. What do people not see? And we have them share it with each other, and go around and share that with each other. We have them go on walks with each other to talk about their masks with each other and the experience of writing them. And then we hang them up, and then we have them throughout the year write on each other's masks what they see in each other as they get to know each other. I see, actually, I know, Bentora, you see, this in yourself, but I actually see this as I've gotten to know you. And slowly we start to do that kind of work with each other. So it helps to build, sort of this empathy, build vulnerability, build some communication with each other, but build camaraderie is what we're also looking for. I heard in the panel earlier talking a lot about competitiveness, and I think that can be healthy to a certain extent, right? Competitiveness. But can we also talk about being teammates with each other, or being on the same team? We always talk about leadership. Oh, leadership trainings. Let's get these kids leadership training, all this leadership training. Amazing. I love leadership training. That's so dope, right? Go Western world as well with that, right? But at the same time, how often do we train and or teach kids how to be part of a group, how to, fit into a space, how to be a utility player sometimes, how to get to know the strengths of other people in that way. It's not just about leadership, but also how do you fit in ways. And maybe that's a form of leadership in of itself too. But I think these sorts of exercises are the
That's
sorts of
interesting.
things we can start to do to maybe shift some of the culture, but we also need examples and models to do the work with them as well. And so I think this is important for us at our age too, as adults, to be doing these sorts of things with each other.
Beautiful.
So we can pull out what kinds of things we might unintentionally pass on to our kids.
Beautiful. Maybe we should create some fellowship trainings instead of just leadership trainings. How to be a good follower. And actually, if you're a really good leader, you really know how to follow because you have to actually listen and empathize. I'm curious, Saeed. I didn't actually know about this, and I'm curious. Did it or how did it shift people's kind of psyches, in a way? Because essentially, you're doing an exercise with them, which is so un-boy box. It's amazing. It's like the exact opposite. You're trying to, it's to some degree healing the boy box, and you're bringing out the vulnerabilities. And actually, people are saying, "Well, I see this in you, and I see that." And how did that work? Did it shift people's even friendships with each other? Did it shift their self-understandings, their self-acceptance, their self-compassion?
Absolutely. And I think the key word there, and it's a word, and I've talked to you about this one-on-one, Daniel. I don't often use the word compassion or compassionate or self-compassion in my work or even for myself. And I think what it did for our boys was increase a lot of compassion and self-compassion with each other. You saw friendships actually deepen. One of the exercises we do with some of our boys is like asking, what do you talk to your best friends about? Right. And it's a lot of stuff about, it's boys, they're talking about sports or TV stuff or whatever. It might be music, sometimes, but the deeper stuff, like, what do you know about their, their parents or, what's it like at home for them? Or, what kinds of things like do scare them? What scares your best friend? Right. I mean, is even a question that we introduced to them.
Wow.
And it's one of those things where we just started to see sort of a deepening of like people started checking in with each other a little bit differently. And they're still boys, right? There's still developmental stages here. It's not like it's not like, the most advanced, therapy group that you've ever seen, but it is the intro to that, right? I think when I was doing the work with grown men, I started to see just how much time we spent training around like just how to talk to each other, how to express a feeling or emotion, or how to just recognize body language in each other or check in with each other. And this way, starting at a much younger, we see that shift much earlier. And so we start to see more of the check-ins with each other, a little bit more depth to language here and there, but really just what a gift to have a space to learn about yourself. And I think in ways, although very much for survival, women have had to do that, throughout history and their lives around gender.
Right.
I think for boys, it's quite a gift as well to just be able to learn more about yourself and learn about your impact on other people. And so I think this kit provides that opportunity too.
Beautiful. It's interesting. The word education, it comes from the Latin educere, which means to draw out from within. And it's a very different meaning, at least my understanding, than how we see education, which is kind of like to put in from without. And I do wonder about that, because I think about what you were saying, Saeed, there, and like you're actually bringing out from within. That's true education to me. And yet at the same time, when we look at the educational system in general, there's so little emphasis. And you guys know much more about this because you've been really involved with boys in school, certainly much more so than I have been. But I'm curious to know, get your reflections on how do we even change curriculum? Like there's a way we think about education. It's like it's written in stone, but education is different, in different cultures at different times. It's like basically teaching people to be, at a minimum, good members of society, right? To fit in, to be productive. But, you know, we see that boys are not being so productive because, in part, because the education isn't helping them become more productive. So I'm curious to hear from at least some of you about what do we do? How do we change curriculum, you know, in a way? And I know that some curriculum is being changed in certain schools, but what have you seen in terms of your own practice and your research about what are like best practices, best programs that we can start really spreading out throughout the United States and the world to really make a difference in terms of kind of the male mentality and becoming happier, healthier, more contributory members of society? How's that for a small question?
Well, and this is kind of Bentara's area, I think, because you do a lot of work with school leaders, and school leaders change curriculum. And what I want to just put out there, which you need before you get to curriculum change, is you need school leaders to be brave and bold, right? You'll talk to school leaders, and the majority of them will acknowledge that our boys are not doing well. And this has been going on for a long time. And even at private schools, right, where there's more privilege and there's more built into the culture around academic success, you hear from a lot of those school leaders that our boys are not doing as well as we would like. They're not trying as hard, right? They're not as emotionally well adjusted, right? But then for most of them, not all, but for most of them, you ask them, so what are you doing about it? Right? So you acknowledge that there's a problem. So what are you doing about it? This is a big problem. Kids, right? And we're talking about boys in particular, too many of them are leaving your school not ready for life, not ready to thrive the way they need to be. What are you doing about it? And from too many school leaders, they're worried about parent pushback. They're worried about emails that they're going to get with the radical change that's needed. And I have ideas for that, but I also know Bentara and others do too.
I do want to hear from you also, Chris, about what those radical needs are and what those changes can be. So, Bentara, let's hear from you.
So I think about a couple of things that have been said along the way to think about how we get there. I don't know if it's specifically the curriculum, but how we impart or how we go about drawing out what's inside of people. That brave and bold idea that Chris brought up really gives a part for how leaders are doing so. One thing they're doing is hiring people that represent males in our campus. If you look at the current population of teachers across the United States, at least, more than 80% of them are middle-class white women. That doesn't meet the needs of the men in their schools, much less the needs of anybody who's not from that demographic. And so making sure that we're hiring people that do so. But when we're hiring them, giving people who are compassionate and understand that there's a contrast between what it means to be compassionate and what it means to be successful or be a part of the boy code. Because when you see compassion, competitiveness does not embody compassion in most cases. But teamwork may, if you're considering how we consider what's going on around this team and how we're being honest with our teammates, how we're being responsive to our teammates, how we're supporting our teammates. Those are all compassionate pieces that you don't often see on the first iterations of it. But when I think about on the very ground level, base level things of what we do in our school about how we talk about the epistemological ways of thinking about engaging with students and with kids and with boys specifically, how about we call them by their names instead of trying to shorten their names? How about we greet them in the morning hello, as opposed to coming and talking about what they need to correct on their bodies, with their pants down, or their belts, or their shirts tucked in, or those things about their phenotypic places? How about we greet them with, hey, let's talk about a love or a hug, and being willing to embrace them with a hug in that morning? Those simple things that we do to talk about how do we build a positive relationship with boys so they feel like they're a part of the team, that they're a part of the community, and they want to do the learning along the way. So just some very simple things that we do that are not very deep in curriculum, but about how we impart or how we employ or how we use the curriculum that we're around.
Beautiful. You know, in the last panel, Mary Gordon raised the Martin Buber term of I-thou relationships. And what I hear you saying, Bentara, is that you're speaking about that the teacher is in an I-thou relationship with the student and really sees the full humanity and is honoring and is acknowledging and recognizing and welcoming the full humanity of that person rather than it's your belt, there's something wrong, which is more of an I-it relationship, and just saying like, come on, fit in, do this right, pick it up, don't drag, get in line, stand up straight, you know, all of these kind of oblique, maybe there's not so oblique criticisms, and basically saying you're not okay, giving the message you're not okay. And it's a kind of a crazy thing when you think about how we on some level educate boys, that somehow if we criticize them, we're going to criticize them into higher performance, you know, and doing better than rather than welcoming them, and that they will naturally want to expand, just like the flower expand, not to be too whatever that is, the flower opens to the sun. You know, I've used the story of the sun and the wind quite often. It's Aesop's fable, you know, where the sun and the wind were having a discussion about who was stronger, and they decided on a contest. And this mountain traveler below was walking and had a coat on, and they decided who would get the coat off faster. And they decided that the wind would go first, and the wind started blowing and blowing and blowing and blowing. And the more the wind blew, the more the guy pulled his coat in and tightened until finally the sun said, "Hey, step aside." Well, maybe not step aside, but the sun came in and had beaming heat, light, you know, and then suddenly the guy just starts suddenly opening up his coat and sits down under a tree. I think we need to make our educational system more like the sun than like the winds. And what you're describing is just so much wind. And what does wind create? It creates resistance, right? And so if we're really going to have teamwork, we really have to enlist people in a real way that says, I see you, I care about you. And I can tell you that having worked as a psychologist for a lot of years, I've had a lot of people say to me that it was a teacher who looked them in the eyes and saw their beauty that made a difference in their lives. You know, and I'm curious what you would say, you know, to that. How do we actually kind of even hire the kind of teachers or train teachers to see the beauty in children? Not that they didn't see that originally, but they get corrupted, just like we can all get corrupted in a more corrupt system. How do we kind of change the system in a way where we add trainings or add things to that so that it becomes much more relational, because that's what we need more?
What a beautiful question, Daniel. I really appreciate that question about beauty. One of the things with adults, you know, that we started doing, and I do it with a lot of, you know, clients I've had in the past and folks, is, you know, we have our teachers and our educators around our students, our mentors, carry photos around of themselves from childhood, from them as children around the same
Beautiful.
age as the children that they're working with. And in moments of tenseness or whatever it is, you know, it's a reminder of, to, you know, the way that we're treating these kids. You know, imagine yourself at that age treating yourself that way, right? You know, be mean to that child at 5 or at 6 or at 7, right? In the ways that, what does the patience look like? And you have patience for this child, and kind of, you know, building on the empathy of like, what was it like when people didn't have patience for you, right? So we do some of that as a, you know, a little bit of an exercise just to build a little bit of more of that capacity. We also do full scale just workshops and presentations with staff and faculty, administrators around bias. I think we have to talk about what's going on internally for us. How do we also show up in these rigid gender systems? You know, what are the ways that we unintentionally socialize our boys rigidly? So, for example, I've seen teachers very much scold our boys differently around crying and showing emotions, as stereotypical as that is, right? Versus our girls, for example. And it's one of those things where, crying, what is crying at the most basic level? It's a need. There's needs going on. Can we be curious about that as opposed to punishing that? And when did you stop thinking that crying was a need for children and started thinking that it was something to be punished and to be annoyed by, right? So what does that look like? So can we pull that out of ourselves as adults a little bit more, and talk a little bit about our biases and the ways that we've been socialized around things like gender and race, and socioeconomic status, et cetera, a lot of things that are impacting our students.
It's very interesting, even using the crying as an example. There's cortisol, which is a stress hormone in tears. So crying literally is a way of de-stressing ourselves. And when you think about what happens with a lot of boys being told that big boys don't cry and being shamed if they do, and they wind up stuffing it. It's like the wind, has congealed and it's pushed something up against the wall. How is a being like that supposed to become a loving father? We're going to have a whole panel on fathers, later on, but you can see how kind of recursively all of these dynamics fit together. And by the way, I just want to put out a call to our audience here, is that I believe we're going to be Men and Boys Compassion Initiatives are going to be working with you all about how do we, really institute some programs and make a bigger difference in the world. Take the brilliant white papers that you all have created and really make a larger difference in the world. So we have 1,350 registrations today, and a lot more people are going to be witnessing this. And so we want to welcome your involvement with both the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative and the Global Compassion Coalition. And you will have a form to fill out. So we welcome your involvement because, as I said in my introductory comments, it takes a movement to change the world. And we want to really have this Men and Boys Compassion movement. That's my little plug. Matt, you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to just really emphasize the point that Saeed just mentioned around biases, because I think that, as we talk about a variety of changes and wanting to change curriculum and wanting to change all kinds of stuff, to me, it's like planting seeds in unfertile ground in many ways. That, we know from research that biases on sex are the strongest ones that we have, and gender. They're the strongest biases that we kind of have. And so in order for us to really make movement on this, we have to confront them. We have to kind of begin to really confront and kind of think about, what do I really believe about? Because I actually think some of the things we're saying, I might push back on. Like, I don't actually believe a lot of people do want boys to be more emotional. I think it sounds good, but I've also been in plenty of school settings in which I hear parents say, being emotional is less competitive. It's a competitive world. I'm competitive. Why would I want my child to be more competitive or less competitive?
Exactly.
Why would I want SEL training in the school when it's not an advantage? And I think going back to what Brenter said, I think what he's really talking about is, how do we get back to this notion of educators having a duty to care? And I heard that phrase from Tom Batty, who's head of the IBSC, kind of saying, that's the International Boys School Coalition, saying that, his ethos is a duty to care for these boys. And that duty to care extends beyond the GPA. It's
Beautiful.
A holistic, whole body, whole person kind of caring for that student in your care. And that's what it means to be a teacher, right? That you care for these children in your classroom. And as an administrator, you care for this population of people that we have.
Yeah.
And I think this is not easy stuff. It might appear to be easy stuff, and it might appear to be like, oh, well, we'll just work on, getting boys to kind of share their emotions more and whatnot. But like you said earlier, when I do workshops and I talk about the experiences that boys are going through and the challenges that they can have, I often look in the audience and I see the horror in the eyes of the fathers. And I see their female partner often pointing him like, that's right there. And it's hard at a generational level to understand that the challenges that boys have today are the challenges that their fathers had, and are the challenges that their grandfathers have, and their challenges that society is going to have in terms of making sense of masculinity, because it's political, it's entrenched, and patriarchy at itself doesn't want you to look at these things either. Male power is about not calling out difficulties that men have, right? It's about actually kind of saying everything is okay, right? And you take care of yourself. And so we're pushing an ethos that kind of allows us to lean into things that are quite challenging. And I think there's compassion in the challenge, meaning that giving yourself the grace to kind of talk about difficult experiences, and giving yourself the grace to understand that for me as a man, maybe I haven't always been my best as a teacher, and as a father, and as maybe a fellow friend to my male friends, right? And looking at ways in which I could work on that. But it really does take this larger kind of effort on how we kind of shift social norms and social beliefs about what boys and men can be.
Yeah, I think that what you just said is really important, Matt. And I agree. You know, I mean, it's not, I think it's very important to acknowledge that simply because we are speaking about the needs to be boys treated differently, and to be, you know, have their vulnerability honored, and to kind of heal or transform the boy code, doesn't mean that there is like massive support, you know, for doing this. I mean, change is difficult. I mean, change takes courage. I mean, we are going upstream, you know, in a multitude of different ways. So there's no question. I don't think there's any question that what you're saying is absolutely true. And so ultimately, we're living in a certain paradigm, and paradigms have a funny way of changing, which is generally, when paradigms have been studied by Kuhn, who was the first one who started speaking about this, there's 3 different stages of paradigms. That's absurd. There's no way guys being more in touch with their emotions, that's a ridiculous thing. How could you ever think about such a thing? And then the next stage is like, well, you know, maybe it's not that bad an idea. Yeah, it seems to make some kind of sense, right? And then the third stage is, of course, I've always believed that. That's always been the way I've thought about it, right? And so that's what we want to get to, that third stage, you know, in terms of changing this male paradigm there. And school, parenting is a very important place to make that happen. And so I'm just wondering, what do you see in terms of kind of national or international programs that are actually have your kind of mindset and focus, that are actually doing this work on the ground right now?
I see one that I'm participating in, or participated in, called the National Fatherhood Initiative. And through the program, there's about a 12-week session where they have gentlemen or men fathers from that specific area. We're talking about things about how their health is, what's going on in their environment, what's going on in their house. It goes through specific areas. One of the key pieces that I took away was the idea of what tradition and reality are. The traditional ways of what masculinity are, what men are, what the boy code is, and then how those things have done their good along the way, but how they're, if we look at the data, they may not be getting us where we want to get. And so reality is there may be some compassionate things that we need to address and be a part of and connect with along the way. And not just as I'm doing it as a boy, but as I'm doing it as a father for my children, for my daughters, for my wife, for my nephews, for my nieces, and for those people around me. And then for those who I'm working with in the school and the environment, for those around that, I'm showing them what compassion is, different from what tradition is, and now looking at what reality is and how this reality is. If I don't apply compassionate ways of being in this humanity, then I'm leaving out who I am as a complete being.
I think, you know, what you're saying, Bentra, is, you know, really important, inclusive of the comment that it's really going to be helpful for girls, women, gender fluid people if boys are healthier, boys and men are healthier. This is not a zero-sum game. And one of my big challenges, I look out in the world, it's like, it's us and them. We get this or you get this, and it's like, no. It's like we're gonna swim together or sink together on this planet. I'm not sure what it's gonna be quite yet, but I do think that it is important to recognize that we are at the very beginning of a paradigm shift, you know, and I'm going to ask you all to, I think you have some programs that people can look at, and I'm going to ask them, we're going to be ending your panel in a moment here, but I think that you're doing very, very important work, and then to recognize that there's room for growth, shall we say. And again, we welcome your involvement. Anyone have any quick last words before we jump into a break for this conference?
I just think real quick, Daniel, you mentioned kind of who's doing the work, and I would point people to look at the work of Movember, and kind of look at the work they've done over the past decade, worldwide, kind of efforts around advocacy, but also kind of grassroots supporting hundreds of programs around men's health, including Indigenous men, and looking at kind of the work that they're kind of doing. I might point to colleagues at Brighton Grammar in Melbourne who have a positive masculinity curriculum model that's K-12 top to bottom. And that there are places out there that, again, I think for those of you who are listening and watching today, it's just kind of beginning to explore some of these resources, looking for ways to be involved. And honestly, like, everyone can be an advocate. We can all be advocates in some ways by kind of looking at where our growth areas are and kind of beginning to push them.
Thank you.
And I'll just add quickly, Wise Guys is another program being implemented in Canada to support boys' emotional growth. But frankly, what we really haven't talked about today, and sorry for introducing a really important thing, is getting to boys directly, right? We've kind of like gotten into parents and teachers and school leaders, but how about having these conversations? And Syed touched upon this a little bit, but like really like intensive, layered, thoughtful work with the boys themselves about these things that we know are problematic and not good for them, and giving them a chance to have that knowledge and then things that they can do about it. And some schools are doing a little bit of that, but it's just a little, and most are not. And that needs to happen. And it would be amazing if when you do this again, Daniel, like, think about having this panel with boys. I actually was on a panel recently that included some high school boys, and it was incredible to hear them when given the opportunity to reflect on these issues.
All right. I love that idea. Thank you for adding that. I think that's a very important piece. I mean, obviously, there's so much to cover here, and I thank you all for all the work you've done, are doing, will do, for your participation in this program. And I welcome again people's involvement in the audience in terms of the work that we're doing. Thank you all very much. Appreciate all of you. And we're going to be taking a break. I guess we're going to have 8 or 9 minutes at this point, and we'll see you back there at five after whatever hour you're watching this in. Is this a behind the scenes thing? Oh, here I'm on.
Yep.
Am I live?
Yep.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I want to introduce our third panel, which is called Men's Mental Health Matters, addressing the crisis of disconnection through male friendships and positive male community. We have a wonderful group of people who I would like to have come on screen now. So if you could bring them on, that'd be great. Hello, fellas.
Hello.
Hey, Daniel.
Hey, great
You're
to see
hanging
all
in there,
of you.
my friend.
I am hanging in there, and nothing like putting on a conference to help with a concussion, I always say, right? So always, right? I hope I never say it again. Anyways, to introduce you all, just to know that your bios are going to go out with the mailing, so anyone who can learn more about you just from those bios and can look you up, because you're all great human beings that are making a big difference in the world. So we have Jed Diamond, who Jed I've known for 40 years or something. Jed's actually older than me, so it's good to have somebody older than me.
I'm older than everyone.
Right? Well, you can't say that yet. And so Jed started Man Alive many years ago and has a new program called Moonshot for Humanity. It's really about focusing on men's mental health.
Moonshot for mankind.
For mankind.
There you go.
Great, thank you. And Ed Adams, a fellow New Jerseyite, not that I live in New Jersey anymore, started a program called Men Mentoring Men. And let's see, we're missing someone. We're missing Boyson.
No, Boyson's here.
Oh, Boyson's here.
I'm not seeing Boyson. Oh, I'm sorry, Boyson. Okay, Boyson is one of the leads of the Mankind Project, which is an international movement for helping men become more evolved human beings. And then we have Russell Colts, who's a teacher at Eastern Washington University, and will share some about his experience with boys, and is also a compassionate mind foundation person and worked a lot with Paul Gilbert, who was on the first panel. All right, so jumping in here right now, I was going to say that one of the things that we're seeing, and there's a bit of chatter about this, is that modern male friendships just aren't doing that well. In general, we're going to be moving from the micro to men's friendships, individual friendships, to the macro, more toward men's communities. But I want to start with the micro. What do you see happening in men's friendships, and what do you see as the challenges, and what can we do about that? How's that for a small beginning question?
Excuse me, Daniel. I'm getting an echo, and I'm wondering if somebody could help me with that, because it's rather confusing.
Okay. Are you getting an echo now when I speak?
Yes, there's a delay in the speech.
Is anyone else?
Is anyone else getting an echo?
No.
No one else is getting an echo?
Are they all wearing earbuds?
Are you all wearing earbuds?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we're just going to have to, the show's going to have to go on. I don't really know what to do with the technical issue right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so given that, why do you think there is these challenge in men's friendships these days? Maybe there has been for quite a while, but what's your sense of that? Anyone can jump in.
It's going to jump first. I'll start with structural and cultural. So I think just in terms of some of the outside systems and outside forces that are at work in terms of, it's been mentioned already, political environments, economic environments, social environments, the way that we live, all of those things kind of work against us forming intimate, deep friendships with other men. I know lots of men right here in my neighborhood, and yet have very few deep friendships just because of the number of things that I have going on in my life. And I judge that's true for most of us.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. For me, the kind of personal big issue was My father going into a mental hospital when I was 5 years old because he broke down as a midlife man because he couldn't make a living supporting his family and felt disconnected from everybody and very ashamed that he couldn't make a living. And it really, for me, kind of cut me off both from myself and from other people because I was disconnected from my father and in a lot of pain myself. And it really wasn't until I got in a men's group, which, has been going now for 45 years, that I really began to break out of that disconnection that I was feeling.
If I can jump in, I think both Boyson and Jed in different ways talk to the importance of contextual factors in terms of shaping a men's ability to form these friendships. And I think in a lot of ways, men exist in sort of competitive context. I think that's the way manhood is framed for many boys from a very early age. And competitive contexts pull for different sorts of relationships and ways of orienting to relationships. I think the second factor really is a skills deficit. I think men aren't socialized as boys in ways that shape just basic, how do you communicate about emotion? How do you recognize your own feelings? How do you language that? And so when you've got this combination of a skills deficit that you don't know how to do it, right? You don't know how to name your feelings and to share them. And then you're dropped into a context in which if you try and you're clumsy, you're punished, you're the sissy, you're whatever. I think it teaches men that this is something that not only do you not know how to do it, but you really shouldn't do it. It's a dangerous sort of thing to do.
Right.
And I think that sets us up to be very tentative in being authentic in our friendships. So that when we come across relational contexts or relationships in which actually we might be able to have meaningful connection, we might be able to have good friendships, we may be reluctant to engage in authentic ways for skills deficits or fear of basic punishment.
Right. I have a lot of close male friendships for many years. I hope to include all of you in that camp. And I think about really a very confusing part about being guys, which is some of you have spoken about the competitive context in which guys tend to relate with each other. And what we're trying to do on some level in a competition is to overcome or deny or hide our vulnerabilities.
Yes.
And so it's an interesting thing because when you think about intimacy, and I'm not talking about sexuality now. I know a lot of times people think identify intimacy and sexuality. I don't, but as intimacy, as the phonetic of into me see, that you're allowing the other to see into you, which actually allows you to create an intimate relationship, to be known, to know and to be known. And yet, when you're raised in a very kind of toxically competitive environment, not toxically masculine environment, but toxically competitive environment, the last thing you want to do is allow people to see your vulnerabilities. And yet the vulnerability itself is a source of connection. Who sets these rules up, right? I mean, it's so crazy like that. I'm curious if any of you would like to weigh in around how you've experienced this, either personally or in your work with other guys where they want to connect, they want to have close male friendships, and yet what it takes to do that is going against the man code, in a certain way, which is to not show vulnerability and to have it all together and all that kind of stuff. Who would like to weigh in on that?
I'll say something about that. One of the things that I've observed with working with men, participating with men for decades, is that men are already equipped to connect with one another. They have the skills. they may be rusty, they may be somewhat held back, but when men are given opportunities to be vulnerable in a safe environment, they go there.
Yes.
When men are available to talk about important things without a sense of being shamed because of that, they will go there. The basic skills are there and can be developed in a way that increases the ability to connect. We're not starting from an tabula rasa here. We're not starting from an empty slate. You know, what I know what Men Mentoring Men does is simply, it's like a garden. What we do is we provide the opportunity for men to connect. We're in the business of connection and compassion. That's the purpose of Men Mentoring Men, is connection and compassion. And when the structure is there, the men respond.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that because for me, there are two parts of what gets in the way. There's the not having the knowledge or not taught, and for me, that a lot came from not having male connections early in my life. And the other is the safe space to be able to feel that we can express our deepest feelings. And for me, that started to open up when I had my first child was born, when my son Jamal was born in November 21st, 1969, followed by my daughter Angela in March 22nd, 1972. And children for me were part of what allowed me to bring out that side of me and to feel more safe to express myself with my own children. And Men Alive, the organization that I started after my daughter was born, really was for me, an opportunity to create a safe space and a place where people could learn some of the skills of deep connection in an atmosphere and in a place where we could support each other in expressing deep feelings.
I think Jed hits it right on the money. I mean, I think that, and actually Ed as well, right? I think when you create these spaces where it's safe for men to feel and be feeling beings and connect in those ways, that we do it, and I think we enjoy it. And I think Jed's example of an infant is a perfect example of, a contextual cues that almost we all sort of recognize. It doesn't matter how tough you are, right? That it's okay to connect with a baby.
Yes.
Right. It's okay to connect with a puppy. It's okay. Right. I don't have to be macho with an infant. Yes. And so there are these cues that say, okay, you can be a feeling being now. And I think the real key is to do what Ed's talking about with his groups and get really curious about, okay, how do we create these contexts for men to be able to do this in like an ongoing way? Exactly. Not in a when the baby enters the room way, but in an ongoing way. And then, and Daniel, you and I talk about this all the time. How do we scale it? Right? How do we create it? And then how do we go big with it? So it's less of these 12 men in this room phenomenon and more of, this 100,000 men or however, because that's how you shift the culture in a way that generalizes that.
Exactly. Boyson, did you want to weigh in on this?
I've heard lots of great stuff, and coming out of the other panels, I've just heard, from the very beginning, is like compassion's built in, relation is built in, the desire to connect is built in, mirroring is built in, like all of those things are built in. But then we run into a deficit of places where we can actually do bids with each other to ask for those things and create the spaces where we can stretch ourselves, right? Like I have lots of skills. I have 20 plus years of skills doing this stuff, and I'm still stretching myself. So it's those experimental places, microcultures that we can create together where men are, okay, you've gone this far. Okay, now what's another step that you can take? What's another scoop that you can take into your vulnerability around exposing even more of what's raw and real. Like, can you respond to another man the way you respond to a puppy?
Right.
Can I be that wide-eyed and welcoming and loving and accepting of a man as he shows up in the room?
Well, I think that all of what you're saying is crucially important, and particularly, how do we focus on context? Because I've long believed that context is king. Like, you put someone in one context, they'll be very different than they are in another context. And one of the challenges that we have so many contexts that are emphasizing the man code, where you're supposed to be stoic and competitive, toxically competitive, because I'm not anti-competition, which is really striving together, but really toxically competitive. And so we have all of these different contexts that lead toward predictable results. And I'm wondering what you see both in your particular context, like some of you are very much involved with particular groups, orientations, and then how do we take those and scale those? Because essentially what we want to do is we want to shift and transform the male paradigm. And that's part of what the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative is about, because we really want to create a men and boys compassionate world. We have to change the context, and we have to change essentially what's rewarded and what's punished. And what we've seen a lot over the years is that when a guy shows certain elements of his vulnerability, if that's punished, well, guess what happens when something's punished? It goes underground, and then it comes out in horrible ways, potentially even violence, certainly callousness and cruelty. And so if we're going to create a more compassionate world, we have to change the context. How do we do that? And I'm not only talking about with men relatively our age or within that range, but I'm also talking about with young boys, teenage boys, younger men. How do we change context specifically?
Well, let me jump in on that because that so resonates with me. So one context that changed when I had children and I had a men's group was I brought my small children to the men's group. So my son is now 54, my daughter's 52. They grew up as children listening to the men talk in the bunks up in the upper bunks while the men's group was going on. So that was the first context change that made things different in my world. And with the men's group, and part of what we do in Men Alive is to bring together organizations and individuals to teach where we can create new contexts. And we've been doing that for 50 years. And more recently, what I talked about in the Moonshot for Mankind is to scale it larger, to bring together as many organizations like these that are here and many others, because we think there's probably at least 1,000 really good organizations that we don't know about each other. We don't know about how do we reach the larger audience. So that's what the moonshotformankind.com is our site for bringing individuals and organizations together.
Yes. And you and I are very much aligned in this, Jed, for sure. And we're I think one of the biggest problems is that all these organizations are doing this separate work. I know that with my buddy Rick Hansen over here, he was seeing that in terms of work that was in some ways related to compassion, but there's all these different kind of solo entities out there. And the whole idea of the Global Compassion Coalition is to coalesce, I don't say the whole idea, but part of the idea is to coalesce these different organizations, because the basic idea is stronger together. And so we really do need to join forces, not against, but for creating a more compassionate world. Anyone else like to weigh in about this?
Russell, you go, and then I'll jump after you.
Yeah. I think there are lots of ways we could do it. I've seen this sort of thing happen in men's groups. I've seen it happen in classrooms. I've seen it happen in online like Facebook groups. I can talk about that later because I'm excited about that because it scales. But I think probably one of the most useful things I'd want to say at this point is to think about at a process level, like functionally, what is happening in those contexts that tend to create these opportunities for men. And as I think about that, I think there are a few things that happen. I think these contexts have to support men being vulnerable. There are some prominent people in the field, and I won't name names, but they preach vulnerability. Vulnerability is only a good thing in safe contexts.
Yes.
Right? And a lot of men and a lot of people of different types live in contexts where it's not safe to be vulnerable. Right. Where you're vulnerable, you could be picked on, exploited, whatever. And they've learned that from hard experience. So I think the first thing we have to do if we want to create these contexts is make sure that they're safe so that when people are vulnerable, they won't be attacked or punished or shamed. I think the second thing that's really useful and important to having these contexts is that the sort of connection and compassion that we want to see is modeled. Yes. Because again, some people will enter into those contexts with different skill levels. And so when they can see a model of, that's how you do that. Right. That's how you share in this way. That's how you connect. That's how you do. It's amazing the things that people don't do just because they're insecure about doing it. Oh my gosh, if I could just go back to 16-year-old Russell and say, all you have to say to her is, would you like to get a cup of coffee? Well, my whole dating history would have changed, right? So having models there that demonstrate what this looks like and how do you do that? How do you be vulnerable? Not only transmits the skills, but it de-shames it, particularly if those models are people that other men look up to and say, wow, if he can tear up when he's talking about something meaningful to him, maybe it's okay for me to feel moved too. I think the next thing we need functionally in those is validation. I think when men take the risk to do that thing, there are other men there that respond and go, yeah, that makes sense to me. That's real. You're talking about something important and meaningful and real, so that they're immediately sort of reinforced for doing it. And they realize, oh, not only I'm not going to be punished, but maybe being real and authentic is a way to be effective and powerful interpersonally. Maybe there's something good about doing this. Right. And then I guess that's another variation of it needs to be reinforcing, right? There needs to be a positive outcome when people do that. And actually, I don't think we have to be as thoughtful about that one as the rest, because when we create contexts where man can connect authentically, and it's modeled, it's inherently reinforcing, because when someone listens to what you have to say and sees how you feel, and they listen and they care and they value it, you can't contrive a reinforcer that's more powerful than that. I mean, there's a whole model of psychotherapy, functional analytic psychotherapy, based on that observation. So that's my 2 cents.
That's awesome. That was really well said. Yeah. So everyone else has jumped in. Scale. So Mankind Project's been around for almost 40 years now. And in the United States, we're supporting something like 750 men's groups weekly or bi-weekly. And what Russell just said is exactly what it is. So you create a context where there is safety, where there is an understood rules of order, like this is how we're going to go. We're not going to go outside of these bounds, where we have ground rules to support each other in the way that we're interacting. And then we're constantly asking, okay, I'll go first and model this. And who would like to follow me? Who would like to come along with me? And then I think, I'm watching the chat on YouTube as well as things are going on. And then it's a matter of integration. So I can learn this skill here. I can learn that this skill is safe here. And then I can practice it in small ways out in the world to start to create environments and safe spaces in other places where I'm interacting. And also recognizing that me going on this journey is not necessarily going to drag everyone along with me. Reminded of the Brene Brown conversation about the man talking to her after a thing and saying, the worst thing in the world would be if my wife saw me fall off this white horse. My wife doesn't want me off this white horse. So there's a level at which we have to expand that circle of safety into other contexts into our lives and be building skills for emotional management, not just emotional expression, but emotional management as we're moving into it.
Yeah. I mean, creating like safe spaces is a term that's starting to occur in the culture. And then, of course, we need to exactly define what exactly safe means, you know, in a way, because safe is a concept, but it's not necessarily an experience. I mean, people can have the experience of feeling safe, but it may not be a one-to-one correlation between the actual context and what a person actually experiences, you know. And so I'm curious about how do we create more safety in a general way so that guys can on some level not see their disclosures that reveal some levels of vulnerability, weakness, challenge, difficulty as unmanly, because that's one of the biggest challenges there is associating this kind of bright night or white light night uh, image of manhood with having it all together, never having any doubts, always in control, always secure, always on top of things, when we all know that that's BS. And so that becomes the persona, the male persona there. Now, having led men's groups for 40 years, I've just ended those. I'm in a new part of my own life, and my Men and Boys Compassion Initiative is my new life. You know, that I've seen over the years of working with a lot of men that not everyone feels as safe as everyone else, right? I mean, there's very, very different levels of how people feel safe. And, you know, there's no way of controlling for that on some level, you know, because people are going to bring in their own stuff. But we have to start early with people that they can be honored, you know, for their openness and not be shamed on some level, subtly or not so subtly, for that. So I'm curious what you see as, to some degree, the role that shame has played in male relationships and how it becomes on some level a guard against the expressions of things that make other men uncomfortable, right? It's like, don't do that. Don't show that vulnerability. It makes me uncomfortable because it brings up what? My own. And I want to shut you down because I don't want to feel my own. And that's a lot of what happens with parenting also with certain people. So I'm curious, you know, on a kind of a larger level, how do we kind of spread the memes and the themes that kind of openness, vulnerability is a good thing, is something that is honored, essentially, making
You
it
know,
cool even.
this is Ed. One of the if a man wanted to start a men's group and say he lives in Iowa or California or New Jersey or New York, he doesn't typically have resources to turn to. And yet there are resources for everything else that on social media, on YouTube. We if in a perfect world, we would all get together and create a kind of a leader's model or manual that we could export no matter where the men are and say, here's your starting point, and here's how we can support your effort to create a small group of men to begin to get on that learning curve. It's a learning curve. Even identifying shame for most men is on a learning curve because we're so used to either shaming or being shamed, we don't really label it that. So I think in terms of scaling, that would be one, using more of our resources in the culture, and a foundation for men who want to go into men's groups or start one, that they find a support and an encouragement for that.
Right.
And that could be international.
You can imagine, Ed, and all that, even starting a men's group is vulnerable. Like asking another guy, hey, like, I'm starting a men's group. Like, do you want to join? I mean,
Right.
that's vulnerable to even let alone have the thought, but to actually take action in there, it takes some courage. And I think part of what we really need to do is to really kind of shift our ideas about what is courage in general, because it's typically or historically been seen as like John Wayne. He stormed the shores of Iwo Jima and he wasn't afraid. Come on, seriously, that's not human. It's like that courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing it despite the fear. And I know that for me, in terms of developing male friendships, I've been willing to talk about stuff that, frankly, most people have not been willing to. I've done it with some of you, and I've done it with, over a lot of years. And I've actually been in a leaderless men's group for 38 years myself. I'm catching up to you, Jed, and so it's like bringing out the things that you can actually feel hurt by, like someone said something like, I know I won't mention names. Someone on this panel wasn't responding to me, and I kept saying, and I was feeling like, hey, come on, like okay, it's Boyson, freaking Boyson, man. And it's like, I felt hurt because I love Boyson, and like, do I matter? And like, I thought we were friends, and I feel a little teary with this. That it's so important to be real, and just to take that risk and to show up, beauty, warts, and all, and say hello. It's like I sometimes kind of joke around like we're all little kids. Well, like they're all little boys inside. There's a little boy inside of each of us, and it's kind of like going like, "Do you like me? I like you. Do you like me? Do you like me?" Like that's what little kids can do when they're really, really young. But then we learn, that's not cool. And then we put on the constrictions, the controls, and the context, of course, helps that, or I don't know if help is quite the right word, but I do wonder, how do we kind of spread in a larger way from young to old that your openness is important. You may not be wanted. Someone, if you would say to someone, I want to be your friend, do you want to be my friend? The person may not want to be your friend, but that's where the courage lies. And the reality is you're not going to know for sure unless you try. And so I'm curious, when you look at your own experiences in life, as a guy, as a leader in your particular context, as a thoughtful person about this, when we look at kind of changing the male paradigm so that we are being more emotionally aware, like yeah, I felt hurt, duh, and being willing to speak about that, because to me, that's your personal truth. Your awareness and your honesty is the interpersonal part of it.
Well, I want to bring in, speak to that point, a shout out to women, because I think for me, I couldn't deal with the openness with other men without being able to deal with some of the shame I felt from women and some of the support I felt from women. And so years before my children were born and I was reaching out to understand women, they were teaching me a lot about how to be open, how to be vulnerable, the whole women's movement. And it was at a women's actually conference that I attended with my wife that allowed men to come, that there were women there that encouraged me to reach out to other men, because I was finding it was hard to find any men that I could reach out to. And it was women that said, don't give up, keep trying. And it felt like that was a key breakthrough for me to get support from women to reach out to men. And it was after that 45 years ago, I started my men's group. So I think part of the scaling of it is to reach out. I know in the moonshot, we have women and men, and I know you all have women, and others attached to the work that you do. And I just want to acknowledge, I actually still have my copy of The Feminine Mystique that came out when when I felt like I was part of that liberation movement. And it shows how far back this goes. 1963, when the Feminine Mystique came out, I got my copy in 1964 when it was 75 cents. That's the little price tag at the top. So women are part of this movement as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for adding that. I'll just add that without my wife, who I've been with for 38 years in 2 weeks, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing, you know, and I shout out to Judith Bell. I'll have a better dinner tonight.
Daniel, one of the things that we're talking a lot about is vulnerability, but I also want to underscore the need for assertiveness rather than aggression or being wishy-washy. And when men learn how to be assertive, to have boundaries, to ask for things they need, to say things to people that are important to say, even complimenting or resolving a conflict. These are all compassionate acts at some level. And it's not just about being vulnerable. It's having the strength to assert yourself and to say, no, this is crossing a boundary for me. And I think that's an important skill to develop, right, concurrent with the idea of vulnerability.
Beautiful. Thank you for really adding that and highlighting that, Ed. You know, I was thinking about how men are looked at these days in a certain way, in a gross fashion. And one of them is like, you're either going to be one of those guys who's like super aggressive and you're really out there and you're take no prisoners, or you're squishy and you won't stand up for yourself. And I think it's the wrong way of looking at it. I look at my men's work I've called Strength with Heart, you know, for a long time, and it really honors both of what you're saying. It's the strength to stand for what you believe in, and it's the heart to open to what is and what could be. Boyson, it looked like you wanted to say something.
In what Ed said, yes, thumbs up to that. And I would say that most of us didn't learn those things, right? So I had role models in my childhood of how my dad handled conflict, how my dad handled boundaries, how my mom handled conflict, how my mom handled boundaries, completely unspoken, completely unexplored, right? But that was just the soup that I grew up in. So as a young adult man, I was absolutely clueless on how to express a need, on how to ask for something that I want, on how to draw a healthy boundary, on learning the difference between boundaries and rules. You know, all of these things that can be taught when we get together and say, hey, I don't really know how to do this. Can we work on this together and figure out how to do these things?
So Boyson, you named the difference between boundaries and rules. Not everyone may know what you're talking about. Please explain.
I have boundaries, which are things that I set for myself. I do this. If I'm trying to change you, change your behavior, change your reality, your perception, I'm trying to set a rule for you. I don't get to do that, generally speaking. I can say, if this happens, then I will do this. That's a boundary for myself. I'm not trying to change you because I realize I can't.
But you can make a request.
I can ask for what I want.
Yes.
Then we're in a dialogue.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Very different.
The courage to speak up.
Yes.
And ask for what you want.
A definition of power that I've been holding on to for some time now is the courage to speak my vulnerable truth.
Indeed.
And what several of you have just described is something that addresses one of the primary obstacles, I think, for men. You know, we live in a culture where there are a lot of grenade throwers, right? Part of the challenge in making these cultural changes is you've got people that are working very hard against these changes. Exactly. And as you've highlighted, Daniel, in previous panels, it's a lot easier to lead people to feel threatened than to lead them to feel It feels safe. It's easier, so much easier to,
Right.
to trigger a threat. But what actually Jed and Ed and Boyson have all said in different ways is, how do you give people, men, a new way of being strong, and maybe even understanding what it means to be strong, right? The anger, CFT, compassion focused therapy for anger groups I did in the prisons were called, the name of them was True Strength. And these guys would come in the first day. And when I said we're doing compassion focused therapy, I got literal eye rolls. And it was a 12-week group, and about session 5 or 6 is when they really bought in. And then from then on, they were the most committed group of clients I've ever worked with. We would do like a multiple selves exercise where we'd have them go through and explore their anger, the angry self. And then we go to the anxious self and the sad self. And it was interesting. They got into the angry self. We'd bring up a situation they're upset about, and they just roll with the anger. And then we'd get into anxiety or sadness, and they'd say, whoa, buddy, no, I don't go there. I use anger so I don't have to feel that stuff.
Exactly.
Right? And they literally said that. I mean, I thought I would have to unpack that. No, they told me I do it. And I said, so, okay. And then I knew I had him on the hook. I'm like, okay, so what, you keep talking about strength. So what's stronger? The anger you use to not feel the stuff you're scared of, the stuff that makes you uncomfortable, or compassion, which would help you feel all of it, which would help you face all of your experience, which would help you engage with whatever's happening. And I think if we can give men a way to understand that actually strength isn't about not feeling stuff, like you were saying, Daniel, it's that courage is actually predicated on fear, right? Courage doesn't exist without fear, right? Doing something when I'm not scared, that's not courageous. That's just me doing stuff. And it doesn't matter what the stuff is. Courage is, it's vulnerable, it's scary, it's difficult, but I'm going to do it anyway because it matters. That's what strength really is about. And if men connect with that, then they can be courageous and connect with their emotions in ways that feels manly to them.
Yeah, I mean, we really are fundamentally talking about a paradigm shift in this regard. And it's interesting how the word compassion is such a challenge to so many people about this paradigm shift, because again, this old idea about compassion as being almost like you pity someone and it's weak. Compassion is what you're left with when you don't have real strength. You know, it's a real profound misunderstanding of what compassion is, because really when we look at compassion and self-compassion, it starts off with an awareness that someone, if it's self-compassion, including yourself, is suffering. It takes strength to actually sit with that and to not do something to distract from that. See, what you're talking about, Russell, is like that when they start feeling with something that feels vulnerable to them, their anxiety, they resort to a defensive anger, you know, as a compensatory move, rather than having the actual courage to sit with that hurts. Because only when you face what is true within yourself and what is true within other people are you in a position to make some difference and to step forward with that. And so I keep thinking about, how do we make compassion like not male centric, because I wanted compassion to be human centric, but how do we make compassion cool? How do we make compassion really part of, I don't even like to use the word, I'm so tired of, you know, like guys need to get in touch with their feminine sides and stuff. I think that's terrible branding, frankly. I think guys would do much better getting in touch with their softer sides, and that softer is not masculine, it's not feminine, it's human, it's part of the human experience. Like, oh my God, how do we expand our operating system? I know, Ed, you've done a lot of thinking about this territory, you know, about making compassion more masculine. And I know you've written about that even, and I'd love you to speak to it if you would.
Well, you know, compassion is built into the equipment. We were born with the capacity for compassion. The culture will nurture that, or it will hinder it. And when when I see men, when I meet with men, I, I've said this to many people. The more I work with men, the more in love I am with men and masculinity. I see enormous giving. I see enormous compassion. I've seen men give their organs to somebody because they needed a kidney. I've seen men who sacrifice day and night working, and so part of making it part of masculinity, or an accepted dimension of masculinity, is to highlight the compassion that's already there, to highlight the fact that it's in front of us all the time.
Right.
In fact, this whole conference is in some way an act of compassion. We've identified suffering, and we're trying to do something to prevent it or to heal it.
Beautiful.
So I think the more that everyday life you start to see through the lens of compassionate acts, the more accepted it'll be. But when we disconnect it from our masculinity, we see it as a foreign object,
Exactly.
or as the research shows, men will often identify it as a feminine aspect.
Exactly. Beautiful. Hey, Russell, I mean, this is a good time for you to talk about that Facebook group, because it really struck my imagination as you spoke about the compassion that you witnessed there.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I was unmuting to try and step in on that. So I've been thinking about this issue of scaling a lot, and it's really hard because out in the larger culture, again, we've got grenade throwers, we got people. I'm not going to name names because I don't want to point people to them, but they're throwing out, saying this is what we need real men. They're reinforcing all these harmful things, and it's a lot easier, like I said, to make people feel threatened than to help them feel safe. But I stumbled across, there are a couple of groups on social media, which is a tricky environment. I'm not super fond of social media. But I stumbled across one group, and it's called A Bunch of Dads. And it's a group of men sharing their experience of being dads, supporting one another. And there are, on any given day, men talking about, where do you take your kid when you've got an afternoon out? Or my wife's divorcing me and I don't know what to do. These are men who, they offer pragmatic advice. They ask for pragmatic advice, but also they're sharing vulnerable. And what's happened is, someone will share a vulnerable post and people will come in and just do all the stuff Ed's talking about. They validate, they encourage, they support, they do all of this stuff. And you just see these men coming alive. And here's the thing. Last time I checked, there were 144,000 men in this group. Now, it doesn't happen by accident. The group has a structure. They have rules. They start out saying, if you join, they say no political posts, nothing racist, nothing inflammatory, and they've got a team of moderators that as soon as that stuff inevitably shows up, they get rid of it, right? Because they're trying to create, as much as possible, an environment that is safe for men to do that. And I think they've succeeded. And so you see these men doing this thing, modeling it, supporting one another. And the reason I'm in love with this particular group so much, and groups like it, is that it's those 144,000 men, which is a lot of men anyway, but it's dads. These are men with boys. And that's how we change the larger culture. Yeah. If we start with men in the larger culture, the grenade throwers come out. But if we start in these 144,000 men at a time, and then they start raising their boys differently, and we've got a wave of boys, a generation of boys, where 3 in 10, 4 in 10 are able to talk about their emotions and don't feel like they have to keep it bottled up all the time and all of that stuff. I think that's how the larger culture changes. I have to tell you, I felt more hopeful since I discovered that group than I have in a long time.
That's beautiful, beautiful. And, I think it's important to recognize that compassion can look different than what we imagine it to be.
Yes.
Like when someone says they've come to work and someone says, how you doing? Say, okay, what's up? My kid's sick. Oh, really? What? Tell me about these conversations can show up in these everyday ways, and guys don't necessarily say like, oh, that must be really hard for you, right? But they'll say something like, that sucks, right? And to recognize that it doesn't have to come in like one little nicely prescribed PC form. It can come in a way, but the major movement is from the heart, and that one heart is touched by another heart, and that's how we need to keep moving this. I'm particularly struck by this group, Russell, that you're talking about, because I think that that's the kind of stuff that really does change the world. I know you and I have talked about scaling, and that's what we want to do at MBCI, because we don't want this to be some little local thing. I know at GCC, it's about scaling, because if we're going to change the paradigm, change the world, it's going to be through scaling. And so I'd like everyone in the audience to be thinking about that. Boyson, you want to jump in here. I'm going to honor that.
I so want to jump in here. So you
Go
said
for it, man.
you said paradigm shift earlier, and I just want to throw a different perspective, which might be it isn't a paradigm shift at all. There's nothing new under the sun. Everything that we're talking about here has been talked about in every major religious and philosophical tradition throughout history. But we have been marketed to, and we've had relationships and masculinity and understandings of gender commodified and changed into things that are for sale, that can be bought, that can be worn like clothes, instead of human experiences that we are all engaged in, right? That was one of the big things that I heard. And then I want to say, like, go watch a video with Hugh Jackman and Ryan Reynolds talking to each other. These men love each other deeply. Robert Downey Jr. and Mark Ruffalo, Ted Lasso. There are numerous examples in popular culture right now where all of these stereotypes and a lot of these biases against men and a lot of like seeing men as two-dimensional are just getting exploded left and right. So like Russell said, like I have more hope right now because of what I'm seeing happen out there, that men's community is a real thing, and that it's just one step for a lot of guys now.
Yeah.
They know it's available. They know it's next to them. And it's just about taking that first risk to step into that space.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I want to just build on that. And what Russell and y'all are saying is talk about scaling. I think it's happening a lot, and it is scaling. And you're just, I see what Russell's seeing in many contexts. I think the time in the zeitgeist, in the energy field of the planet, is recognizing the passion in compassion that is part of our, our inherent being, part of our DNA, and it's starting to arise. There's a movie documentary that's you will hear about called Sensitive Men Rising that is launching on Father's Day. I tell people more about it. I've posted, but beyond any individual thing, if we just open our hearts and open our communities and open our videos and all the different ways we communicate, I think we'll see that this is happening, and we just need to build on it and connect it and open our hearts to being able to hear all the different ways that it's manifesting.
Beautiful. I hate to say this to you, Jed, because I know you've written a lot of books, but you just said something that grabbed my attention. I mean, all of it did, but I love that term, the passion in compassion. I think that's beautiful, because I think that really is, and we think about passion as coming from the heart, and calm is with passion. It is passion that drives us. It is that interest. It is the movement of the heart, that cares, and that we care. That's why we're here. That's why GCC is here. That it's like, I know my buddy Rick, who's sitting next to me right now. He's done many things in the world and written lots of great books and lots of great seminars and everything, and could easily retire. And his wife wanted him to, but they said no. I think I have a little something left to do. Like, I'm just going to start this global compassion coalition, right? Just some minor little thing that's that now has over 130,000 people who've signed. I'm sure many people who are who are listening to this are part of GCC, and we welcome you to GCC because I feel very connected to GCC and to MBCI. Anything any of you want to say as we come to completion here today? Last
Yeah,
I
I
would like to say something as well. Go ahead, Russell.
it just occurred to me as I'm thinking about this, as you're talking about passion, and Jed's talking about all these different ways this is coming up, that this is a really ripe moment in the history of our culture for this to happen. And I think you've got a coin with two sides of it. And I think I want to shout out to women, as you did earlier. I think the women in the feminist movement has pushed us to this point, because women have gotten to the point where they're not taking the old way of being men anymore, and they're not sitting back. They're saying, this isn't okay. I'm not going to take this. This isn't okay anymore. And I think what you're saying is men responding in two different ways. I think we're seeing a lot of male anger. And I think it's, in some ways, it's justified, because I think there are a lot of men who are like, hey, I'm just doing what you taught me to do my whole life. And now you're telling me I'm a bad person because of it? Now you hate me because I'm just doing what I was taught to do the whole life. The other side of that coin are all the people Jed's talking about, all the men who are saying, you're right. The way we've been taught to be as men for years is not okay. And we need to do better. And more men and more context are doing exactly that. And I think the more we have conversations like that, the more we fuel that movement, and hopefully can address the anger part of it. But I think, they're two sides of the same coin.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say very quickly that my dad was on Guadalcanal, and he was a warrior. People were trying to kill him for 5 years. I needed him. We needed him. We needed men like him. We needed strong men to take those kinds of enormous risks of their lives. But when he came home, if he came home, but he did, I needed his love and his tenderness and his affection. I needed his support. I needed both sides of him. I needed that strong, powerful, I've got boundaries kind of guy, and I needed tenderness. And that's what we're really talking about.
Right on. Right on.
Yeah, let me just say one last thing for me, which is that notion of passion in compassion came up for me in this group today. It started for me at the morning when Daniel wasn't sure you were going to be here, and you were clearly, really pushing it to be present, and your willingness to be teary and pained and hurt. I think that's what all of this is about. And the fact that this is happening today and is building from today and many years that we all have been doing this is the movement that we're all been waiting for.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Nothing like leading a conference to help them with recovery from a concussion, I always say. All right. Thank you all very much. You're all awesome. We'll be in touch, and all of your information will be posted, and we're going to be moving on to the next panel now.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all for the work you do.
Thank you.
All right. Moving along, we are on to our last panel now, which, where am I at? In my notes, is making room for compassionate dads. And we are missing one person in your, which is Warren, but I'm going to start with you two. Hello, James. Hello, Danny. And hello, Warren.
Well, good to see you.
All right. Warren.
Hey, Daniel.
Warren, hey, buddy. Warren and I talked. We wanted to make sure that we were color coordinated for this. Because guys like to talk to each other, right? To make sure that,
and we especially care about fashion coordination.
Right. The right. Actually, Warren and I are friends, and we always comment on each other's clothes, and I have to dress up to be even in Warren's territory. All right, so welcome, gentlemen. Danny Singley, current president of Division 51 APA, awesome human being. You're all awesome human beings. I can fortunately say that. and creator of the Men's Center for Excellence in San Diego, James Kirby, our Aussie. We made sure this was the last panel because it's 5 a.m. In your neck of the woods right now. Thank you for getting up so early, to be with us, and as a compassion-focused person also. Paul Gilbert's had a lot of influence on this whole deal and runs the Compassionate Mind Foundation. Is an amazing researcher as well, and he and I are working on a project together. And Warren Farrell, who is may need no introduction, but I'll give one anyway, who's a wonderful human being and has written a whole bunch of different books. Particularly of interest in our conversation today is the boy crisis and how the boy crisis relates to fathers. Warren has written a seminal book, which I highly recommend everyone get, even though he was on my case because I didn't read the whole thing, but I'm over that for a while. Good. All right. Okay. So I'm curious, just to start off with, how can dads be involved in authentic, meaningful, and productive ways with their sons? And I'll open it up here.
Dan, you want to start?
Sure. I want to throw my 2 cents in, but for full disclosure, part of what I was really excited about on this panel was to soak it in from the rest of y'all, because I super respect your people, what you're doing. Given that we're here talking about compassion, and I've had a real focus on self-compassion, to me, one of the key dynamics to focus on when we look at fathers, and in my case, looking at fathers of young babies' involvement, is to look at what are some of the internal, like the intrapersonal barriers that might make it harder for them. And as a lot of the previous panelists and previous talks have talked about, the man box, the bro code, and so forth, being a highly involved, hands-on, empathetic, nurturing, compassionate father, certainly, the research is pointing to the importance of it for the father himself, for the baby, but there are all kinds of internal barriers that can make that difficult, from gender policing to whatever my modeling was for my own father. And so as a first step, I encourage fathers and then the people around the fathers to tease that out. Like, what are the factors internally and externally that would encourage that involvement, and what would hold it back? And in the literature, the number one factor that seems to facilitate fathers being highly involved with their young children is their sense of having a solid and supportive relationship with the birthing parent. And so that has all kinds of implications, but I'll wrap it up there.
Great, thank you.
I'll go, or James, if you'd like.
You go, Warren.
Okay. So I think one of the things that is really important, when I was doing the research for the boy crisis, I think what surprised me the most was the degree to which dads did things intuitively that they didn't even know the value of. For example, roughhousing, helping children take risks that are fairly safe, sometimes a little too much, that it's valuable for the mother to be involved in the process of checks and balances with that. But very few dads, for example, understand the value of roughhousing. And we even know this from animal research now. And so oftentimes, and what is involved in dad style roughhousing. And the good news is that any mom can do this. It's just that dads are more likely to do the roughhousing. And the mom is more likely to look at the father who's starting to maybe throw 3 kids on the couch and say, okay, the game here is for the 3 of you to jump on my back and pin me down before I pin the 3 of you down. And mom is going, oh my God, I feel like I have only one more child to monitor here. And he's freaking out. And the mom is saying to herself, I think sooner or later somebody's going to get hurt. And she's only about 99% likely to be right. But then at the end of the process, when somebody does get hurt, the dad often gets involved and says, basically, there'll be no more roughhousing, Jimmy, if you keep, putting your elbow into Jane's face. And so what the data shows, and nobody, no dads know this and no moms know this, what the data shows is that roughhousing in dad's style, where the roughhousing stops when it gets too rough, that leads to the children having to be forced into paying more attention to their siblings' needs, which increases empathy. And it also increases postponed gratification. The kids would like to have the gratification of pushing their brother or sister aside, but in fact, they're forced to not do that in order to get the big treat of the roughhousing. So roughhousing is often to kids what a treat is to a dog. The dog is willing to do what is needed because it doesn't get the treat, and the roughhousing is the treat. And so dads don't share this with moms, and moms can't hear what dads don't say, and dads don't read, even if they read books on these things, I didn't find them in any of the books that I read to prepare for the boy crisis. And so that for me was dads understanding why they are needed, moms understanding that father involvement is a woman's issue. Women should not have the burden of raising children and by themselves. It doesn't allow them to do other things well. They often feel frustrated and overwhelmed. And so it has to be all of us together contributing. And most importantly is the courts knowing that when there's a divorce, that children need both parents and there should be equal shared parenting time. So that's a few things for starters there.
Of course, depending on the health of the mother and father, because sometimes it'd be better for them to be with the boy if the mother is a danger to the child and vice versa.
Yes.
Right? All things being equal, shared.
Sure, yes. And any virtue taken to its extreme becomes a vice.
Indeed. I don't know anything about that. What are you talking about? All right, James, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, just some small thoughts. I think one of the things which is really important to build that kind of meaningful and authentic connection with kids is, and probably this is more so of kids a little bit older, maybe more like when they're not in there as babies, but say more in that 3 to 12 age, but also older. When they come to you, if we can make yourself, when possible, available to them, because they're coming to you. But so often, and we're busy, things are on, could be busy with after work stuff or doing stuff around the house, or we're just not in the mood. But so often we can say no, or a little bit later, or tomorrow. But then you've lost a chance of connection. So the child's come and they want to be with you at that moment. That's often the best time for us to be there with them. So you don't have to be playing with them for the rest of the evening. So often it's a case of the more kind of frequent, but smaller time periods that we're with kids when they want us to be with them is often a wonderful first stepping stone.
Mm-hmm. Right. Beautiful. I want to share with you all a story, and I want to take a little hitchhike from that, which is that many years ago, I led or co-led men's workshops called Healing the Father-Son Relationship. Mm-hmm. And they were attended by adult sons dealing with their fathers. And we were wild, pillow hitting, and it's like I had my own animosity toward my father, who died when I was 10. Like I was an abandoned boy, essentially, which I'm pretty sure led to my involvement in doing men's work, because I was not fathered. I wasn't fathered well before he died. Certainly in his absence, definitely not. And I had my own resentments about that and unprocessed emotional material. And they were very intense, powerful workshops, and were very focused on guys expressing frustrations, how they wanted to be loved by their fathers, and they were quite powerful, and they went on for years. I mean, not the workshops, but the number of workshops. Mm-hmm. And then I had a son, and it was rather interesting, because my son is about to be 35 right now, so it's a little while ago. But I remember holding this little infant in my arms. It may have been the first day he was born, and holding him. And I suddenly became aware of something that completely escaped me in leading these workshops, which is that I was leading these workshops as an adult son. I had no sensitivity to the father. Really, I just didn't get it at all. And I felt, and my son may be listening to this right now, and I felt shy, just holding this little being. I felt shy, and what do I do? And just insecure, and just like it was amazing. But and then all of a sudden I realized, wow, I had all these guys come through these workshops and who were pounding pillows about their fathers and not having any compassion, toward their fathers, because I didn't have compassion. And I'd love to open up a conversation about how do we have essentially more understanding of the challenges that fathers face in general in a world that doesn't frankly value the father role as much as the mother role in terms of parenting. And to recognize that guys don't know what they're doing. All of a sudden they've got this kid, they're like, what do I do now? There's no training for it. We don't have much education about becoming a father. And we certainly don't have very much compassion toward fathers.
Yes.
And lastly, I want to say is that from what I've seen with a lot of fathers in my work with men over the years is that there's also a lack of self-compassion, that it's hard, it's challenging, and that we need to, on some level, lift up compassion toward fathers and also from fathers, in terms of their own self-compassion. I open it up to you.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that one of the things that I think is really important to remember is that when men are told they are needed, they respond. People, throughout history, almost every generation has had its war. And when we said to men, we need you to go to war, men were willing to die when they were told they were needed. And so Uncle Sam needs you, and men responded. And so one of the things that I think we as men need to know is not only that we are needed, but why we are needed, and to have mothers understand and why we are needed. So, for example, statistically speaking, when studies that have been done on sleep time show that moms will set sleep times earlier than dads, but children being supervised by dads are more likely to actually get to bed earlier than children being supervised by moms. And so what's the difference? One of the differences between boundary setting versus boundary enforcement. The children will come up to mom, and let's say the bedtime is 8:30, and say, I need to get to, mom says it's time to get to bed, and the child says, oh no, mom, I haven't finished my homework yet. And mom will say, well, I definitely don't want you to go into school tomorrow without, your homework being done. So, okay, we'll give you more time to do your homework. And then I finished my homework. So can you read to me as a reward? And now it's 9:30. Dad has the time set at 9 o'clock, but is more likely to say after one or two times, some version of, I gave you a chance. You had a chance to do that homework there. If you're not doing it, you're going to have to go into school and face the consequences. And from many moms' perspective, this seems pretty cruel and insensitive. From many dads' perspective, this is the way he learns to not stall when he could be doing the homework again. And so so dads need to understand that their boundary enforcement tendencies, because I have a son who's even worse at boundary enforcement than my daughter, so these things can reverse. But there's a need for us to understand what dads are contributing, for dads to understand that, for moms to understand that. So it's not just a matter of I don't get along with my husband, we're having a divorce. He'd be better off with the new man that I'm meeting. There is a power in the biological dad that is very powerful because the son, and especially the son, looks in the mirror and what he sees is his biological dad.
Right. Thank you, Warren. James, Danny.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that really quickly, Warren, that point you just made about roughhousing and what the Gottmans call that sort of jazzed up paternal play style is so important, and I've seen some really interesting research looking at how that positively impacts children, even from a very early age. So my own research is on fathers' involvement with infants and babies, looking at what fosters that and what holds it back. And I think it's important just to ask, just historically, to contextualize. For the longest time, the research of fathers' involvement with their children boiled down really to two factors. Are they around? Do they live there? And two, are they contributing financially or with resources? Both of which are important. However, that's a pretty minimalist, old school way of looking at the role of father. And a more contemporary one, it has to be more multidimensional. It must include more nuance that looks at, for example, the play style that Warren was just talking about and positive engagement, but then also doing the work of it, the ability to, change diapers, take the kid for a walk, go run some errands, take them to doctor's appointments and so forth, even when they're not cohabitating, right? So like finding ways to be engaged and to be involved. So to me, one of the number one most important things that has changed, I think, over the last 20 years, certainly in research and then trickling into practice. And I definitely want to hear from James on the practitioner front. If we want to weave in compassion and a compassionate look at modern contemporary fatherhood, we have to look at those foundational, financial and being there. And Warren, I love what you said about boundary setting versus boundary enforcement, but we also have to open up for more models and to show respect for, and not gender policing that beats down these fathers that are also just doing what amounts to basic run-of-the-mill domestic care that moms have been doing for most of history.
Yeah, just adding to that, often in therapy or in workshops with the dads that I speak to, you'll often hear the words, "Oh yeah, but I don't do that as good as my wife," or "I don't do that as good as mum." And so there's an immediate kind of judgment about their inadequacy on perhaps reading to the kids or perhaps dealing when they're sad. But that dads still offer just a different way of engaging with the kids, and it's really important for that kind of ability for dads to have a go at doing it and children to receive it, and for children to, particularly if they're boys, see dads do it so they can start to model it as well later in life. But that's just, I think, constantly underestimate how well they do these little things, and how there's not one way to address someone who's sad. There's not one way to read to the kids. There's not one way to perhaps play or color or whatever it might be. Just being involved and doing it with the kids as dad is the win.
Absolutely.
I wonder also, in terms of this, all three of you are speaking about, I think, very important and related issues. And I think about how often dads just feel isolated. I mean, they're going at it alone. There may be a dad group here or there, but there's not, from what I can see, correct me if I'm wrong, there's not like a lot like these massive men's communities, or like how we're helping men become better fathers. How are we helping men connect with other men around fathering, around the challenges and the opportunities they face as fathers? It's just like they're supposed to just do it on their own, and they're taught, it seems, that mothers can do it better, they know more. And there may be some truth in certain ways about that, but they come in with a lot of insecurities. And when you think about how that relates, those insecurities, to the man box, which is, you're not supposed to talk about those, you hide those, and you keep those to yourself, and you be stoic about it. And so you have this crazy cultural box that puts men in, and that men kind of live in, and most men, like most of the time. And at the same time, they're told that they're privileged That's a whole other kind of area. And they're second class when it comes to parenting, and they're not getting help because of the boy box. It seems like quite, I don't even want to use the word online that comes up to me that I would use with you personally, but it seems like a conundrum, at least. And I wonder, when we think about it systemically, because we really are looking at, like, the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative systemically. We're looking at how do we move from the micro to the macro? What do we do on larger levels to kind of increase the understanding, increase the compassion, increase the teaching for fathers and mothers, really, about fathers, to make a difference in terms of how they are parenting the children to really create a more compassionate world ultimately? I know that's a small question.
I think you're absolutely right, Daniel. And I think, first, fathers need to know what they contribute that is unique. And then mothers and fathers need to be able to have good ways of communicating about it, what I call checks and balance parenting. So for example, dad might say, a kid might say to mom, can I climb the tree in the backyard? And mom goes, no, sweetie, maybe in a few years you can, but right now you're too young and the tree is too tall and you could really hurt yourself. And the kid runs to dad and says, oh, can I climb the tree in the backyard? And dad says, well, yes, but be careful. And then the kid is climbing the tree, and mom is, looking at, what is this? I said you couldn't climb the tree. Well, dad said I could. And so now what do we do? And so one of the things about checks and balance parenting is for the mom, first of all, for the dad to know the value of climbing the tree. I don't know of a single dad who knows that children that climb trees and take risks actually increase their IQ, and they increase their ability to determine what risks to take and what risks not to take. But that's not the final answer. The mother also has a contribution to make about making sure that kid doesn't go up too high in the branches and out on branches that are too thin, or if the child falls, will not get a concussion or kill him or herself. And so the checks and balances parenting requires both parents to know the value of their contribution, and both parents to know how to hear the value of that rather than interrupting them and just saying my value is better than yours. But maybe coming to some compromise, like, okay, that Jimmy or Jane can climb that tree, but only up to a certain point, and not out on these branches. And if you really want him or her to do that, you got to be out there under the tree in case they do fall. And by the way, give me your cell phone, and so you don't get distracted while they're climbing the tree. So then what does the kid get? They get the benefits of climbing the tree, the benefits of risk taking, but the safety of not killing themselves.
Right. Thanks, James.
Yeah, this is something in Australia we've been trying to address at a sort of a government level a lot, and that is access to parenting and free access to parenting support and advice, because parenting is often very rewarding, often amazing, but can also come with lots of challenges and difficulties, particularly when the kids are, doing things that you've got no idea of, and the one or two things you've tried hasn't worked. And then, as you kind of pointed out, like, what's that network like that you can turn to and ask for, hey, Tom's doing this, I don't know how to manage it, I've tried everything, you got any ideas? That kind of sort of social connecting and discussing, other things you could do to help in those parenting situations are somewhat limited. There are play groups and things like this you can obviously turn to, with dads often still in some kind of full-time work that makes it difficult. And in some instances, it's kind of frowned upon to be talking about home life at work, because at work you got to stay sort of focused on what it is that we're doing. So it makes it difficult sometimes to be able to reach out and talk to people about parenting and parenting approaches, and normalizing that it's hard, you don't always have the answers, and it's difficult. And so we've tried to make, if you ever need parenting support, you can get it, you can go see someone, and you'll get it for free. And I think that's really important, because it destigmatizes it to begin with, and also makes it obviously affordable for people to access. And it's also important to also balance that with the idea that you know, there are many children being raised in family environments which are not excellent. You know, there are still very, you know, frighteningly, if I can say the word at this time in the morning, rates of child maltreatment, you know, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, you know, and dads have a role there as well. And so it's kind of like, how do we really address this kind of stuff on a public health level? And we got to make access available for parents to be able to get help and support with their parenting. But it's still sometimes shamed. You're sometimes shamed for not knowing how to be a parent.
Well, you know, in terms of that, James, I'm curious because, you know, what you're saying, it seems important to me. And I think about the man box, which is one part of is asking for help, right? And so this is all predicated, you know, on the guy reaching out. Now, obviously, if the guy totally screws up, then there's a reach in there, and then you're in a different system, you know, at that point. But I wonder, you know, to some degree on a larger levels, how do we normalize for guys? And this isn't only about fathering, obviously, but just like, I need help. I don't know what to do. Can I talk with you about that? And not just, you know, reaching out to a therapist, and that's important. I'm in no way dismissing that, obviously, but to create like a larger sense of this is acceptable, because we human beings are wired for conformity. I mean, let's face it, we want to fit in. And if you're doing something outside of the man box as a guy, even if it's important, it feels super vulnerable. So you actually have to be courageous, you know, to do that. And at the same time, if you don't have a kind of internal support system and you're not having an external support system, what do you do?
James, would you share a little bit about the sheds in response to what Daniel's talking about that are so much more known and popular in Australia than they are in the United States?
Yeah, sure. And there are a couple of different groups now that you can kind of access. One is the man shed. And so these are kind of opportunities for men to go to, you know, often the man shed is you kind of go there and there's like things that you can do. So things with your hands, often there's sort of, you know, tools and so on. You can start working on something, but at the same time, connect with another guy there. And so you can talk to them and discuss things that are going on. And so there are lots of these kinds of men's sheds around the community, embedded within the community. So it's like easy to access. Like you don't have to go, you know, 40-minute drive down the road to find one of these places. So they try to embed them in the community to make it easier to access to. So there's a lot of those. And not just that, there's a lot of focus at the moment on rural and remote kind of man's equivalent sheds, but not run by necessarily man sheds. Again, to try to promote connecting and often trying to connect sort of, you know, that can be that awkwardness of you're just in a room. So it's like, let's give some things in the space that you can engage with and do an activity which will promote connection. And then the talk will kind of go alongside. I don't know if you wanted to add anything further to that, Warren.
Well, I would in a second, but Dan hasn't had a chance to talk for a bit. Dan, do you want to contribute?
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Warren. Part of what jumps out at me, Daniel, in your initial question is about where do these dads find communities, and not just communities, but compassionate, positive ones? Because if you look virtually and you get out into the manosphere, there's a lot of negative stuff out there, including like having to do with different fatherhood focused, you know, sites and social media. But one of the points that I find to be really this sort of direct dynamic tension is that, Daniel, you said it in an earlier talk, you know, the subtext of reaching out to somebody is, I like you. I really like you, and I want you to like me. And this is the way that children talk, that we get socialized out of us. And for a lot of these fathers, they'll go through the initial sort of year or so postpartum where everything has changed and they're feeling kind of like maybe invisible or disengaged or not as relevant, which is unfortunate. We're working against that. But as you move ahead, so my colleague up at USC, Darby Saxby, she talks about the onset of parenthood as an inflection point where changes in sleep, changes in diet, changes in friendships tend to all move in a less healthy direction. And one of those is the social support piece. And the dynamic tension that I'm talking about is at the same time as these friendships, that male friendships, when they have the dude to dad transition, they're harder and harder to maintain, and they do less and less of it, is accompanied by stress, which means we actually need more of that support and connection. But we don't, bro dating or rolling up to a different dad and being like, hey man, you seem cool, like let's do this, let me get you, like that's harder and harder. But the tension is between that, and when you have a little kid, the opportunities to connect with other dads at whatever the preschool thing that they're doing, or you just run into them at the park, or you're taking them to little activities or whatever, they're all over the place. However, the awkwardness of pushing through that and being like, hey dude, I like your t-shirt, you into Pink Floyd? Yeah, me too, or whatever the thing is. We're not setting fathers up to have the sense that this is okay, and it's super important.
Well, how do we do that? I mean, because to me that's a really important point you're making, a crucial question, which is that even in environments where the potential is there, guys often don't take the opportunity to do so. In part because it feels threatening, because there's the potential to be humiliated, to be rejected, to be ignored, which are not human experiences that people particularly value. To put it mildly, obviously. So there's a risk factor to that, and so I do wonder about that, and in a general way, but certainly for dads, in this particular case, how do we encourage and courage guys to take that risk, to reach out, to connect? How do we do that?
I think part of it is, guys, we need to do, education programs and have, like Florida is doing, they just contributed $70 million to educate dads as to why they are important, and also educate moms as to why they are important. And the good news in this divided culture is that in the House of Representatives in Florida, it passed the House legislature by 100% of the Republican and Democratic votes, which is just about unheard of, and yes, in this culture. And they're beginning to do that in other states. So what do dads need to know? They need to know that, when you look at prison populations, about 90% of those people in prison populations are dad deprived. That when there's a lack of father involvement, the children are far more likely to drop out of high school. They're far more likely to go on drugs. They're far more likely to be addicted to video games. They're much more likely to be failures to launch. They're much more likely to be unemployed in their 20s. And there's 70 metrics like that when fathers are involved, those things that both mothers and fathers want for their kids, that nobody wants their kids to be on drugs, et cetera, that this is one of the great win-win situations. And from a legislative point of view, this saves trillions. I calculated about $1 trillion of taxpayer money would be saved per year. And the costs of prisons, the costs of drug, rehabilitation, and on, if we were to put more effort into fathers. Now, fathers don't know this, so we can't, and moms don't know it, and it's really this is a root problem that is deeper than just solving a mental health problem after it is created. This is preventing the mental health problem from getting there to begin with. And in addition to that, we as men need to learn to do what you're talking about, Daniel, which is to be able to say, I don't know, I'm hurting, I need help. All those things take courage. So we need to reframe it as the new type of courage.
Exactly.
And we also need to simultaneously educate both girls and boys. I remember when I was had been divorced and I was beginning to date, going out with a woman. She and I really had very strong feelings, positive feelings about each other. She came over to my house and she said, I'm too enamored of you. Can you tell me one thing about you that is not like, that would help me minimize my enamoredness, so I don't feel like I'm making love potentially with somebody that is beyond what I feel comfortable with. And so I shared one minor thing with her, and then nothing happened that evening. And I walked her to the bus stop in New York City, and she said, I don't know what happened, but at some point I brought along prophylactics and everything. But at some point I just lost it. And I knew exactly what point she lost it at, is when I shared with her that one minimal thing of a fault. And suddenly, so the knowledge on our part that sharing what is asking for help, not being strong, has also an impact on many women and their feelings toward us. And so, but we need to start educating in junior high school, both girls and boys, about this dynamic and how it was useful in the past when women had to find men who would be super successful and be willing to die in war. It's just not nearly as helpful for emotional intelligence now.
Yeah. Wow.
Two things to add, like in healthcare, for example, there's research showing that if a medical doctor is in need of some kind of help because they're feeling depressed or anxious, and if they tell a colleague, other colleagues will see them as the less competent doctor, and they'll receive less referrals. So tragically, this is that's not isolated to medicine. This is across almost all fields. And so this is a massive, real problem, and why a lot of people don't open up their vulnerability, because it immediately has impacts on how they're seen, how people look at them, and also their competence, which can result in some big work issues. The other thing also is there is one environment where dads are fantastically involved, and that's often in sports. So if on a weekend, there's no shortage of dads willing to help out and volunteer and try to assist. So there is one domain there that dads do really good at. They might not even know much about the sport, but they're willing to throw their hands up and be vulnerable in those circumstances, because it's almost subscribed with man box rules, I suppose, that sports is something that you would jump in and help in and be willing to assist. So you see a lot of volunteering on the weekends, dads doing this, and it's great. The only sort of downside to it is men are also much more likely to say inappropriate things at sporting events, particularly of their children. So they feel it's appropriate to yell, swear, and say things to children in that context, which they don't believe is appropriate in other contexts. So it's a wonderful environment that I think men do really, really well at, their level of volunteering and helping.
Well, the good news is I won't ask you to tell us what inappropriate things they say, James. Right.
That's right.
I think
I'm going the other way. I want to hear an example of an aggro rugby dad, but maybe later.
I think one of the things that schools need to know also is which children are dad deprived, and particularly how coaches can reach out and sort of a male coach can be very helpful there, sort of reaching out to a boy and talking to him about his strengths. Absolutely. And also about what he's doing that is keeping his strengths from being really exhibited in a positive way. And this is one of the great sadnesses about Boy Scouts being, having had the fallout of so much molestation in that community. Because I remember when I was a Boy Scout, just being taken aside by, and for a long walk with a Boy Scout leader, and him telling me just exactly what I just said, some good things about me and some things about me that I really needed to change. And that had a very long-lasting impact, even though I had a very critical father that also was not at all hesitant to tell me what needed to change.
But I think that that's a good example of compassion, and a way that compassion is misunderstood, because generally people tend to think about compassion as like, oh yeah, you can do it, like rah rah, you're okay, like all encouragement, or if you're having difficulty, poor kind of like, I'm so sorry that you're suffering, and all that stuff that is generally seen as like a way someone's compassionate, versus another way of compassion, which is more dynamic compassion, which is essentially going like, you can be better than that. You're not, you've got the talent, you've got the skill, you've got the drive, but you're missing something, dude.
Yes.
So when we think about like the classic male role as provider, protector, motivator, we can bring that in. In a way, and that's part of what I'd love to see expanded in terms of how we even view compassion. Because I know for me, I don't want someone to rubber stamp, how I see things. Warren, you certainly haven't done that with me. I mean, it's like, I want feedback about how I could be better. I want people in my life who are going to be kind about how they deliver feedback, but also to deliver feedback and to recognize that the feedback itself is compassionate, because what are you doing? You are trying to help someone become better. Ultimately, when you internalize feedback that makes sense, I'm not saying that all feedback is awesome or great, but when you internalize really important feedback, as you were saying, Warren, but from this Boy Scout leader, you actually become more resilient. And so you actually are able to handle life better than you were before. And I think that there's a kind of safetyism that's going on these days with how we're raising children. We don't want to make sure that they're comfortable all the time. We don't want, there's trigger alerts. And, and I just want to say, I'm not opposed in a way, a little bit I am, I want to be sensitive to other people, but at the same time, to not create conditions in which they're never triggered by anything, because you know what? Life is triggering.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're talking about roughhousing or whatever. Like, life is triggering. Like, if you don't get some knocks on, I'm not saying we should purposely do that, but I am saying that part of what we could be doing, even in terms of like fathering, and even how we treat fathers, like, yeah, dude, you could be a better father, like, and get support for that. It makes a better family unit. It makes a better community. It makes a better, larger world. And so I'm for people feeling as safe as possible, and I want to create conditions as much as possible where people do feel safe, and to recognize that sometimes we have to challenge people to be better.
Yeah.
Right.
I love it.
In a healthy way.
I love your expanded definition of compassion. That's really very, very valuable. And you, by the way, make it very safe to share things that aren't just positive with you. You have a really knack to do that. Dan, you haven't had a chance to say anything recently.
I 100% agree. Going back to sort of how do we do that? How do we create these communities? One example from my personal life is that at my kid's school, when my now 20-year-old started in kindergarten, I got a look at the lay of the land, which was that dads were virtually never on campus. And the parents group was entirely moms. Like, there was one dad that was on that group, and I kind of tried to get a little involved there, but it wasn't really sort of the friendliest thing. And what I did was then a colleague of mine at a different school, I ripped off his idea and started what we call the Dads Club. And it was basically just like the dad's analog to the traditional, sort of being involved, the parental stuff, but except we were completely without administration. Like, there were no board meetings. It was just, we would come together and say, hey, let's do a volunteer thing on campus where we're going to get together. And we were able to like pull our kids out of class briefly and like paint something or set up like a play structure, or we do like bagel breakfast. And it was to help these fathers have more of a sense of actually, this is part of what I'm doing, and that I belong here. And that had legs. Like that took off, and we set up like a father-daughter dance, and that's persisted. And I have a real sense of pride in that, because it was a mostly mom space that now is a more gender inclusive space at the kids' school. And I could see these dads giving themselves like, hey, actually I belong there. And that's like really fulfilling to me.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all. I'm going to give you all a last statement, and if love to hear just last words of wisdom or not wisdom from all of you. But before I do that, I actually want to just say something. You acknowledged me a moment before, Warren, about that expanded view of compassion. And I want to tell you that I did hear that, I think, first from Kristen Neff from Mindful Self-Compassion, which is a wonderful body of work. And so and I do think it's a very important way of looking at compassion. So I'd love us to really, in general, view compassion through that lens. Okay, so last words from any of you.
Dan or James?
Make sure that it's the most brilliant thing you've ever said, but no
James,
pressure.
Be profound.
Dad, I suppose just dads don't underestimate the good you can bring to kids. Those moments that you have with the kids are fantastic moments. So don't try to focus on the outcome. Just try to focus on being there with them if you can.
And having seen you with your kids, you're a great dad.
Thanks, Dad.
And by the way, part of compassion is receiving the gifts of others, right? And just letting that in, and getting over the tall poppy syndrome, which is a term that Australians know quite well.
Yeah, very much so.
Daniel, I would say, as it relates to compassion and fatherhood, my personal experience, and certainly I've worked with at this point, well over 1,000 dads over the years in different capacities, is one of the main intrapersonal blocks to self-compassion, and in some cases compassion coming from others, is that critical inner voice. I don't know any parents, I don't know any fathers that don't have shame, that don't have a sense of regret. And I know for me personally, when I've authored my most recent parenting fail with one of my boys, even if I've given him a really heartfelt apology, I'm stuck on that. And what I don't tend to get stuck on is, oh, wait, here's something about my kid that I think came from me that is freaking awesome. There's that humor, there's that love, there's that zest. That stuff goes to the side. And so I would encourage us to be aware when I get stuck on that stuff. Another way to frame that is, that's not me failing. That's not me being wrong or bad or not a natural parent. That's me doing the best I can with what I have and learning as I go.
Thank you.
I would say educate and legislate. So men, educate yourself as to what you do that is a special contribution that you make as a man, and then learn how to communicate about it to the world, to your wife, to your partner, and make sure you don't think of it as the only good, but something that you have to contribute. Make sure you educate yourself as to how many ways your involvement benefits the children, and that once your family gets to about $75,000 of family income for a family of 4, depending on where in the United States you live, the happiness of families increases when there is more time with the family as opposed to more time with the workplace. Don't be seduced into thinking of yourself as a success by the higher you climb on a ladder of being a human doing rather than a human being.
Beautiful.
And finally, make sure that you participate in the campaigns to bring about equal shared parenting after a divorce, and learn how to communicate effectively so there won't be a divorce.
Great. Beautiful. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate you. And we will be posting your bios on the site, and also will be sent out. And I really appreciate all of you personally and professionally.
Hey, I wanna acknowledge you, Daniel, that really having the vision to put together men and boys and compassion, when compassion is largely thought of as a feminine noble trait, and that men are heading like this has been something you've championed all along, and I so admire the authenticity, but also sort of the dogged earnestness as you're moving this ball forward and keeping the compassion. Like compassion is manly. Like, going earlier, violence is lazy, compassion is courageous. I'm with it. So Wade, thank you for convening this, Daniel. This has been great. And to Warren and James and all the other presenters.
Thank you so much.
And for all of the work you did to make this happen in a way that isn't just 5 people communicating with 5 people.
Yeah,
rather,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Many blessings to all of you.
And you too, Daniel.
Okay. So final words. I want to, you guys can be on or not, I'm not sure, but just a, okay, bye. So we've come to the end of this conference, and I thank all of you in the audience who have spent your time with us and who will in the future. I thank all the panelists. I thank the GCC folks, Alex, Matt, Rachel. I particularly thank my good buddy Rick Hansen, who's been sitting by my side this whole time, passing me, hi Ricky. He's been passing me little notes. Why don't you freaking talk about that? No, he didn't say that. But anyway, so I do welcome your involvement with the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative. You will be sent information about how you can be involved. We're really just growing right now. The next conference is going to be, I believe it's going to be about gender compassion. We're going to have a lot of women and a lot of men talking about how do we have compassion through the genders, because I think that's really one of the biggest conflictual areas there is. Not enough compassion towards self, but just so much enmity and so much like unnecessary strife. And we need to overcome this. We have strife everywhere, politically, socially. It's a mess, right? But as it's been said, if we're not going to be part of the solution, we're part of the problem. So I want us to step up and really do a better job at being compassionate toward others, being compassionate toward ourselves, receiving the compassion from others, and really spreading this. You can be involved with the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative by filling out the form that you will be sent. Highly recommend that you be involved with the Global Compassion Coalition. And thank you all very, very much for your time, energy, and your focus. Many blessings.